Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hi, I'm just waiting for the video to load so that you can see me. You are not obliged to share your videos. I'm Karabo Kholeng, and welcome to the ANFASA, The Power of Authors 2022. It is such a pleasure to have you here today. It's the second annual Power of Authors virtual symposium. And this is a conversation among authors about authors to debate and speak about the crucial role that authors play and have played in bringing about change in society. I'm Karabo Kholeng. I'm a literary journalist and student, and I'm very passionate about promoting literature and the livelihoods of authors throughout the region. So on today's program, the conference will be divided into three distinct parts. We're going to debate, explore, and re-establish the role that influential authors played in the past and the present. We're going to look at claiming the right to earn an income and exploring ways of strengthening income for authors. Authors are the creators of knowledge, and their creation has economic value. And rather than asking if authors can make a living from their work, the question will be posed, is the role that authors play adequately rewarded? And what is the status of the author in society today? And we're also going to look at the role and contribution of authors in the development and preservation of South Africa's indigenous languages. And we're going to ask whether there are enough books written or translated to and from indigenous languages. And we're going to welcome, get an opening address from Professor Sihawukele Ngubane, who's going to open the conference and welcome the attendees. And I'd just like to thank you all for being here with us today. Professor, are you available? Is Prof here? Okay, I cannot see Professor Ngubane. Let me just check with our organizers. Samu, do you know if Prof is going to come through? Samu, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. My name's Kim, but I don't see.
All right.
See how anyway.
Can hear you, Karabo.
I can hear you, Karabo. My name is Mohapi, surname.
I can hear you.
Hello, Mr. Mohapi.
Fine.
I can hear you, Karabo. It's Monica.
Hello, Monica.
Hey.
All right. So it looks like Professor has not been able to join us, but let me take you. Let's just talk through the program quickly in terms of how we're going to conduct things this morning. We're going to, discuss the giants of letters with Dr. Bongani Nyoka and Sandile Ngiti. Unfortunately, Prof. Daniel Majila did send his apologies yesterday due to unforeseen circumstances. He can't join us today. And then we're going to look at power in indigenous languages, earning a living as an author, which is something that I'm particularly interested in, considering that, the economy, the cost of books, and how do you turn this into a livelihood that is sustainable? And then we will have a conversation where everyone will get to participate and share their thoughts on what you would have gained from today's conference and any other pressing matters that you'd like to raise and the reflections on that as well. So I don't know if Professor Ngubane has been able to join us as yet. I cannot see that on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the virtual room and I'd just like everyone to introduce themselves and just say, what your role is and what you're hoping to benefit and to gain from this morning's conference. And do you mind if I announce your names as I see them on my screen? I hope that would be okay. And but I'll begin with Samu, who's been very key to getting this together. Samu, good morning. Please introduce yourself to the virtual room. Not here. She's inside the room with me. Yes, Samu, come to me and say hello to everyone.
Hi, hello everyone. Good morning. My name is Samu. I'm the National Coordinator for ANFASA. I would like to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming through, and we're looking forward to your valuable inputs and all your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Samu. Been running around and getting us all ready. I am trying to start my video, and as soon as that happens, you'll be able to see my face. I'm just having issues with that right now, but hopefully we'll be able to sort that out. And let's see who I'd like to say hello to next. Mahlamela, good morning.
Good morning, Sis Karabo. And good morning to all the participants. I am a student of literature, of languages, of life, and I'm hoping to learn more from the conference. Thanks.
Fantastic. Welcome to you. And next, Heta Pieterse at UNISA Press. Good morning.
Good morning to all of you, and thank you for organizing this ANFASA. I'm here firstly as a publisher to also hear what authors need and what they want, but also I'm also a creative person that's starting to write more and more. I've completed my M and I think I'm going to carry on studying. I've started doing book reviews as well, and I'm also finding my voice as an artist and author, so listening on both sides of the spectrum. Thank you. And I see, of course, many here that I know. There are authors from UNISA Press. It's nice to see you.
Excellent. Thank you. Estelle Nietlin, good morning.
Estelle, you need to unmute.
Estelle, please unmute your mic.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, welcome.
I'm Estelle Nietlin. Thank you very much for arranging this conference. I owe a lot to ANFASA for assisting me in being able to write my second book, which was published by UNISA last year. It's called Escape from Lubumbashi, and I'm very keen to hear what other authors have to say about their experience about writing, especially nonfiction.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Welcome to you, Estelle. And Euphodia Tsatsi, good morning.
Good morning. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning. We can hear you. Please
Yeah.
introduce yourself and what you'd like to gain from today's conference.
My name is Euphodia Tsatsi. I've just written a book. It's still in a manuscript form, but it's going to be, it's in the process of being published. So I'm very new in this field. So I will just like to learn from other authors and just to guide me and, you know, even what to do when you already have a book.
Excellent. Welcome to you, and congratulations on getting your manuscript together. I mean, it's a huge task. I'm always incredibly, you know, humbled and thrilled when people are able to produce a manuscript and get it ready for publication. It is a heck of a lot of work. Professor Ngubane is on their way, so as soon as they're ready to give their opening address, we will cross over to them. Good morning to you, Mokhadi. Hello, Mokhadi. All right, I can't hear Mokhadi. Sibongile, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear you.
I'm so sorry. I have my granddaughter on nebulizer here, so I'm so sorry about the noise, but yes, here I am. Good morning.
Thank you, and I hope your grandbaby becomes is going to be all right. Ngcebakazi, hello to you. Ngcebakazi is in the room with me. And Sandi Lengiti, greetings, sir. How are you? Hello, Sandile. All right, let me keep it moving. Mboniseni Ndlovu, are you able to speak to us? Good morning. Please unmute your microphone. All right, that's not happening. Peter Schneider, hi, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to you all from Canada, where it is 20 after 3 in the morning. So it's very nice to start my day early with all of you, and thank you for your kind invitation today. I'll turn my video on just to wave and say hello from my home in Ottawa, Canada.
Welcome, and thank you for staying up or getting up really early to join us. That's really fantastic. Mam Eleanor Sisulu, good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning. And I'm not going to put my video on because I'm in my dressing gown, but I will say good morning. And I'm very happy to be with you all. And that I'm very proud of ANFASA. And we need to support our institutions. So people must pay their membership fees, including me. I promise Samu a payment shortly. ANFASA is our organization and we need to work to make it thrive. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. And yeah, these membership fees are really important to be paying, you know, because of the kind of support that ANFASA has provided for authors over the years. So Zodu Mongiti, good morning to you. Hello.
Good morning. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. I'm Zotu Mongeti, and I'm an aspiring writer. I've started drafting something in the children's books, short stories in the main, but I'm here to basically just network and learn. Thanks.
All right, and then folks, we're going to continue. We'll introduce ourselves throughout the course of the morning. I just see that Professor Siaukele Ngubane has joined us, so looking forward to the welcome address from Prof. Welcome to you, Prof. Good morning. Prof, you're still on mute.
Hello, am I audible now? No.
Yes, Prof, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just saying that I do apologize for late joining because of some challenges in the technology, but I'm glad that I've made it.
You're most welcome, and we're really glad that you were able to join us. So please go ahead with opening today's conference and share your words with us, Prof.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Greetings to everyone. I'm very excited to be part of this conference and also to be witnessing the second Power of Authors conference. We started this initiative last year, which was our maiden conference, and it was a huge success. And this year we are also looking forward to another successful conference. I think the buzzword these days is resilience. We have been struck by COVID for the past 2 years, and we are trying to survive the consequences of the pandemic. But it is good to see all of you in attendance today. And I think it's a great moment for us as authors to come together and discuss our issues as authors. And I think this opportunity is crucial after the experiences that we've encountered for the past 2 years. And I think today's deliberations will be successful. We will be sharing our ideas and connecting our minds as to how we can contribute to the development of our societies through our writing, through our wisdom. And I think today we will showcase what we have achieved. And I know that some authors have been writing all along. They've never stopped writing, and they've endured all the pains of writing under these circumstances. But today we decided as ANFASA to host another conference just for us to be together and discuss our issues as authors. And I just want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to our conference today. I hope you will all enjoy the discussions, and good luck with to the speakers as well. A special welcome to them, and thank you very much for agreeing to participate as speakers in the conference. I hope the discussions will be fruitful. And at the end of the conference, we will make some kind of new resolutions to ourselves, not as ANFASA, but to ourselves. And also, we are looking forward to suggestions from the discussions on how we can proceed with this conference, because we have agreed at ANFASA that this conference becomes an annual event. And thank you for making this possible. Welcome to all and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Sandile is Sandile Nkiti's put in the chat that the audio is not that groovy this morning. I wonder what could be the cause of that. Look, that's the thing, when we're dealing with technical issues and bandwidth and all of that, we have to just keep hobbling along as best as we can. And I hope that everybody can hear me clearly. And if there's an issue, we'll just keep trying to sort that out. But thank you so much, Professor Ngubane, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, one of the most senior and accomplished isiZulu linguists in the country, whose visionary perspective has earned him opportunities to work on local and national strategic positions as a leader of the African Renaissance movement in KwaZulu-Natal since 2002. So a good 2 decades pushing the promotion of African Renaissance and the isiZulu languages. And he also chairs the Pan-African Writers Society as well. Now we're going to move on to discuss the giant of letters with our guests today. As I mentioned, Prof. Daniel Majila won't be able to make it today, but we will have this discussion with Dr. Bongani Nyoka, who is a lecturer in the Department of Political and International Studies at the university currently known as Rhodes. I wonder if that name will ever change. Holding a doctorate in sociology from the University of South Africa, Dr. Nyoka is the author of 2 books, Archie Mafeje, Voices of Liberation, published by HSRC Press in 2019, and The Social and Political Thought of Archie Mafeje at Wits University Press, 2020. And the latter book won the 2021 Rhodes University Vice Chancellor's Book Award. And he's also a 2013 Codesria Laureate. And Dr. Nyoka's research interests include African intellectual history and revolutionary theory. Good morning, Dr. Nyoka, and welcome to you.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And having this discussion with Dr. Nyoka is Sandile Ngiti, who grew up at Amahlongwa on the KwaZulu-Natal South Coast, a poet, art critic, and literary translator who writes in isiZulu and English. Sandile is a student at the University of Cape Town's Department of Historical Studies, courtesy of the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the groundbreaking History Access Program. He's an associate of the Archive and Public Culture Research Initiative and the 500-Year Archive. And his forthcoming MA mini dissertation is on Mazisi Kunene's epic poem, Emperor Shaka the Great, 1979. Sandile is committed to critical scholarship that centers Blackness and rises against the violence of Western modernity and its present ever-mutating traumatic and maddening aftermaths. In 2018, Mahlepula Press published his poetry chapbook, You Can't Tell Me Anything Now. And his poetry features in Halala Madiba, Nelson Mandela in Poetry, a collection published by Aflame Books and edited by Rax Siakwa and Richard Bartlett. And together with Prof. Innocentia Mhlambi, Sandile is the editor of Mintiro ya Vula Vula, Arts, National Identities and Democracy in South Africa, published by Mistra via Jacana Media. That was last year in 2021. Sandile is also committed to radical intellectual practices that question colonial and neo-colonial archival practices in South Africa in particular, and agrees with the recently departed literary scholar, Professor Belkisi Peterson, that the 21st century must turn into indigenous language models if what is sought is a properly self-defining intellectual history. So I would like both of you to first give your presentations. What are your thoughts on Giants of Letters and the ones that you are particularly focused on and that you're keen on, that you would like to even see a revival in the way that we understand their work, and how do we expose them to different publics as well? And I'll begin with, but first, welcome Sandile. Can you hear me? And is the audio still not groovy on your end?
Thank you, Karabo. I can hear you loud and clear, my dear sister.
Excellent. So you've also, yeah, we're going back to school, hey?
Hallelujah, we've got to. Certainly,
yes,
certainly, my dear sister.
Okay, wonderful. But let's begin with Dr. Nyoka. Just your thoughts on this topic and what you'd like us to think about when we speak about Giants of Letters in South
Africa. Thanks for the invitation, and also thanks to you for introducing me. So, as you said, when you read my bio, I'm interested in African intellectual history. And so my work appears in the context of these debates around decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing higher education. But if we study these issues historically or place them in their historical perspective, you find that these discussions are not particularly new. So if you go back to 1885, for example, the Xhosa poet William Wellington Qoba wrote a very long poem, serialized poem. It was published in 7 parts. It appears in Isikiti Misama Xhosa, the Xhosa Messenger, which was a newspaper here in the Eastern Cape. And this poem is entitled Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngezemfundo, the great debate about education. And it's really about the impact of Western education on Black people, or colonial education on Black people in South Africa at the time. And you go back to the works of Charlotte Maxeke on women's rights in the 1910s already, and the role of the church in liberating Black people. And you also find in the works of Bernard Vilakazi and H.I.E. Dlomo, who were debating the question of language and modernity as early as the 1920s and 1930s. We also find in the works of the Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop and Kenneth Onekwaduke in Nigeria in the 1950s on the role of African historiography, and Egyptian civilization. And here in South Africa, you have women writers such as Noni Jabavu, who is a contemporary of theirs, writing about women's rights in South Africa. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, South African, mainly mainstream South African social scientists were debating the question of reforming higher education as well as knowledge, and what Willie Murrow called epistemic access. And this debate in the 90s changes and takes the form of the notion of transformation, transforming knowledge and transforming higher education. But parallel to these debates in South African universities were Black intellectuals who were not in the mainstream. And they were talking about indigenizing or Africanizing higher education, or Africanizing and indigenizing knowledge and knowledge production. And in the 2010s, obviously, particularly after Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, people started talking about decolonization. And this notion has gained much more currency than the notion of reform and transformation. But I'm principally interested in the works currently of two figures, Archie Mafeje and Bernard Magubane. Both of them were born in the 1930s here in South Africa. And Mafeje born Engcobo here in the Eastern Cape, Bernard Magubane in Colenso in KZN. And I mean, their trajectories are quite similar. Both of them. Mafeje studied at UCT, he left with a master's in social anthropology, went to Cambridge University, obtained a PhD in social anthropology. Bernard Magubane went to the University of Natal, left South Africa in the early 60s, went to UCLA, got a PhD in sociology. And their works appear in the mid 60s. And they were part of a Black cohort that tried, a radical Black cohort that tried to critique the social sciences as such. But mainly at the time, the debates, particularly in North America and the UK, radical social scientists at the time were criticizing the discipline of anthropology as having been the handmaiden of colonialism, so that anthropologists were seen as agents of colonialism. But Archie Mafeje's intervention in that debate was that, look, it doesn't make sense to isolate anthropology and turn it into, quote unquote, the black sheep of the social sciences. What we need to do is to study the development of the social sciences as such, and how they developed in Europe, and how they were in the service of the Enlightenment. And so what anthropology was in the colonies was what the other social sciences were in Europe. The only difference is that anthropology was in the service of studying hitherto unknown societies, Africa and other parts of the global south. And so instead of negating anthropology in the social sciences, what we need to do, Mafeje argues, was that we need to critique all the social sciences and undo them. And his substitute for the social sciences as we know them today, he says we need to adopt not trans or multi or interdisciplinarity, but what he calls non-disciplinarity, a non-disciplinary approach to the social sciences. But of course, I mean, Mafeje was a Marxist, and therefore his substitute of the social sciences was firmly within the Marxist tradition. And so he says, Marxism is the best anthropology that there is, so that this new non-disciplinary social science should take the form of Marxism. Of course, his critics intervened and said, I mean, look, what we are saying is no different from what we know already as radical social scientists. And of course, in the late 1990s, he changed his argument about Marxism as being the best substitute for the social sciences as we know them. And he said, okay, what we need to do now is to adopt what he calls African ethnography. And so this is meant to be a substitute, he says, for the social sciences as we know them. So how is this to work? He says, we need to study African societies on their own terms, generate theories from African societies based on African knowledge systems. And he says this is African ethnography. And so his approach, of course, to theory building is inductive insofar as he wants to learn from African societies and generate theories based on the knowledge systems of the African people. Of course, his contemporary, Bernard Makubane, had a similar approach, but he wasn't particularly critical of all the social sciences. His focus was on anthropology, sociology, and history. And he says, we need to collapse the discipline of anthropology and history into what he calls historical sociology. And he relies heavily on the works of the American sociologist, Sir Wright Mills. But his approach, unlike Mafeje's, is of course deductive insofar as he doesn't see a problem, as Mafeje does, with studying African societies with a preconceived theory or an epistemology. Says we can learn from thinkers such as Marx, Sir Wright Mills, and others, but he was particularly heavily influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois, particularly on the question of race in the US as well as here in South Africa, because he saw these societies as being both settler societies in one way or another. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I like about Archie Mafeje, particularly on the role of the African intellectual or intellectuals in Africa, is that he has these three categories. And he makes a distinction between three African scholars or African intellectuals. The first, he says, is a complacent intellectual. Says these are your mainstream intellectuals who are uncritical of the status quo. And then you have the second kind of African intellectual, which is a Shanghai intellectual. He says this is the intellectual who is otherwise critical of the status quo, but is heavily reliant on donors and funders in terms of shaping his or her own research agenda. These are your activists and your NGO type of intellectuals. But then he has a third category, which is a much more critical category of the African intellectual, which is the transcendent intellectual. He says this is the intellectual who learns from the African societies themselves and leads from behind instead of speaking for the masses. So this kind of intellectual is a revolutionary intellectual. And yeah, I think maybe I should stop there because I don't have a particularly structured paper in this talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyoka. Some very interesting points raised there, and the history of Archie Mafeje. You know, this idea of the Shanghai intellectual who's a critic but reliant on donors. I mean, that is the reality for a lot of scholars of social sciences, particularly in South Africa. I can't speak for the entire African continent, and it does influence and shape the way that a person theorizes, right? Because you're always thinking about who's actually keeping the wolf away from the door while you're coming up with, while you're trying to theorize and do your scholarly work. And I mean, the transcendent intellectual, I think we'd all aspire to be that one, but we can't be sustained by fresh air, right? So, you know, that combination of when do we can we envisage a future where we've got African patrons of scholarship, where we're not reliant on foundations that made their monies of exploiting the labor of Black people and exploiting the land of of Africans. So in terms of balancing those competing demands, I think it is very interesting, and it's also sad that in 2022 we're still contending with that, with that kind of challenge, because it does really affect how you produce your work and whose agendas and interests you kind of promote and advance through your work.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I remember the HSRC and UNISA organized this annual Archie Mafeje Memorial Lecture, and I think it was 2018. It was delivered by Dr. Ibo Mandaza from Zim, and I was asked to be a discussant, and I mentioned these three kinds of intellectuals, and he said, maybe we should stop at the Shanghai intellectuals because the transcendent intellectual does not yet exist. So, yeah, I see that there are some parallels between what he said and what you are saying now. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. You're raising an interesting point, which makes me wonder what Archie Mafeje himself, where he would locate himself in terms of these three categories of his.
Mama Sisulu says in the chat, and everyone's welcome to participate via the chat as well, that the presentation is fascinating, and she appreciates the way in which you're making these scholars accessible, and also says that we are Shanghai intellectuals struggling to be transcendent. But let's move on, because I also want to keep to time. I'd like to hear what Sandile Ngidi has to say about Giants of Letters, about the role that the influential authors have played in the past, present, and future, and in his own scholarship. Sandile, over to you. Are you there, Sandile?
Oh, hello, Karabo. Dumelang. Yeah, I hear me.
Yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to everyone. Good morning. Good morning to ANFASA. Good morning to the wonderful panelists that are here with me. Of course, I'm coming after the superb, delightful Dr. Bongani Nyoka. So it's quite a task to follow this wonderful scholar, a dear brother of mine. I just have to make my contribution from the very depths of my heart. I'm a student, and I begin with the picture that you see on your screen right now. This is 1964. This is 1964. It's a cold London And the black man on your left in the picture, not that clearly visible, is Moses Gunene, who turns 92 today, which is one of the major reasons I was quite pleased that you had invited me to say a few words on this wonderful event ANFASA has organized. This was a march in London with dear comrades to protest the sentencing and subsequent execution of 3 MK Umkhonto weSizwe members who were the first to be murdered by the apartheid state in that dark period of the 60s. Of course, Vuyisile Mini is possibly the most well-known, but there were others, Wilson Kayingo and Zinagile Mkaba. I start with this photograph to just take us back to a world in which the figure of Moses Gunene, our great poet of epics, emerges on the global stage, so to speak, because he had left South Africa in 1959 and had, at the invitation of the ANC, specifically the ANC president, Oliver Reginald Tambo, famously known as OR, he had been asked to lead the ANC in Europe and North America in 1962. So he emerges in this photograph in 1962, fresh from home, fresh from the fires of home, still reeling with the aftershocks of Sharpeville and other disasters and other painful episodes that marked the period. But also the 60s also is an occasion for the heightening of resistance. Umkhonto weSizwe has just been formed in 1961, but of course, Moses Gunene is in this photograph representing a broader movement, a broader Pan-Africanist movement of solidarity with South Africa, but with other African states and other spheres of occupation, as it was the case with occupied Tanzania at the time. So I'm starting here because there's a little part, there's little known about the figure of Moses Gunene in the public imagination that goes beyond Zulu poetry, and that goes beyond his work on cosmology and so on and so on. So this is a universal Pan-Africanist figure involved in the struggles for justice, the struggles for equality in South Africa and other parts of the world. In brief, let me introduce Moses Gunene. Moses Kamdabuli weGunene, owakuzidluzi waziwaqhawula, the one who gave praises to his ancestors till he shook her hand, was born in Durban on 12 May 1930. After attending school at Amahlongwe, a family closely associated with the United Congregational Church, formerly the American Board, Gunene started his political activism in Durban. Some of his friends at the time included Ben Makosezwe Makubane, a figure Nyoga writes about pretty well, Johnny Makachini, Phyllis Naidu, Mek Maharaj, and his mentor, of course, Moses Stimela Mabhida. As I've said earlier on, he left in 1959, and he was to play a pivotal role in the struggles that were happening in exile in many parts of the world. His surviving sister, Standiwe Gunene, describes her brother as a Durban native, referring to the fact that unlike her and many others of her generation, Gunene was actually born in Durban because his parents were working. His father was working for the American Mission Board, and they were in Greyville at the time. So he was a true Durban native. People who know that period, they know what it meant to be a native of a city and to be somebody who came from the reserve, what later on became known as the Bantustans. So Mtimande is remarkable for several reasons, and I won't be able to deal with all of them. He's a multi-layered figure. But the very fact that he's generally known as a Zulu poet, a leading Zulu poet that is useful, but not entirely useful in giving us an expansive range with which he saw the world, with which he saw his role in the world of African letters, in the world of literature, broadly speaking. And it is also important to link him to a generation that, to an ancestry that includes Izimbongi, such as Mkai, Nonsis Mkweto, Benedict Wallet, Pambata Vilagazi, Andreas Ngidi, Undiliase, and his dear friend, JC, Bulima Ngiege Dlamini. Mazisi Gunene has got several major influences that have shaped his work in different ways. These include the poetic traditions of the Zulu royal court in the figures such as Makulwane and Mshongwe. He also drew a lot of inspiration from the epic traditions of the Greeks, the Mayan civilization, and so on. Yet it is perhaps time to consider the possibility that through exile, exile for Mazisi Gunene discharges a whirlwind of political and aesthetic imperative forces whose consequence, was to disrupt aspects of a narrow Zulu poetic idiom, constrained as it was by the strictures of apartheid censorship in favor of the endless epical artistic freedoms that ironically, exile invokes in an artist. So for instance, I'm looking at the work of Mazisi Gunene, Emperor Shaka the Great, the epic poem published in 1979 by Heinemann. This poem is subtitled as a Zulu epic. It was a seminal moment in African literature when this work emerges. Here, Gunene dedicates, the work to the heroes and heroines of the African continent and all her children who shall make her name great. Right from the outset, a discerning reader may notice the poet's coupling of Zulu and African identities, emphasizing a Pan-African worldview that is the thrust of this discursive discussion. The topic, in a sense, allows one to say, oh, P. Mazisi Gunene, how can one locate him? And as one of my dear colleagues, Atambile Masola, Dr. Atambile Masola suggests, indeed, there are so many layers, through which to look at Gunene, and all those layers are important. And ours, my task at the moment, as a scholar looking at his work, is to focus on some, and hopefully, other scholars will do the same. One, it is important to say that Gunene indeed was a Pan-Africanist Imbongi whose imaginative writing happens to be in Zulu, but the Pan-Africanism imperative in him Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Estelle, please mute your microphone. Thank you. Continue, Sandile. This is fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So many of his poems are largely informed by poetics of a conscious belonging and solidarity with the political and liberatory struggles of the peoples of Africa and peoples of African ancestry in general. In this sense, Kunene's significance in the articulation of Black aspirations in the 21st century is as important as that of Amos Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, Lorraine Hansberry, Miriam Makeba, Ngugiwa Thiong'o, and so on. But also what it does with the epic, Emperor Shaka the Great. He begins to respond to the historiography of the conquerors and the questions its validity to inspire the oppressed, to aspire Africans wherever they may be. And these are the concerns of Kunene. So I'm linking into an African cultural tradition, a Pan-Africanism, because I think he belongs to all these worlds. But I'm also aware that Pan-Africanism has over time taken different forms. But I'm saying that as scholars like Ndongela Masilela have said, that there are ties that bind for Mazisi Kunene in the world that he encounters, particularly when he's in exile. And these are the ties that mark his work, that mark his imaginative work through poetry. And towards the end, because I know that I don't have much time, about Pan-Africanism, this is worth saying, that apart from the different strands of Pan-Africanism that one may identify, but for me, one fundamental tenet of this tradition is the idea of the unyielding common solidarity and what I regard as gestures of reciprocal respect among peoples of African descent, solidarities in moments of pain, in moments of oppression, and so on. Towards the end of his 1987 novel, Ant Hills of the Savannah, the eminent African novelist of Nigerian origin, Chinua Achebe, evokes Mazisi Kunene's Emperor Shaka the Great. He does this in a few lines, where one of the main characters in Ant Hills recalls the tragic demise of Shaka and how he's said to have embraced his moment of truth, his inevitable assassination. So this introduction, in a sense, says that Kunene has to be located broadly within traditions of African poetry, commonly known as Izimbongi, but also his pivotal role in the struggles of solidarity across the world through the ANC in the main have to be factored in for us to appreciate the breadth of his commitment and his activism in different areas of his life. So lastly, let me end with a poem that is taken from the first section, part one of Emperor Shaka the Great. It reads, "Age of the gods, after 1,000 years of silence, the gods sent to our earth their message. They descended from the sacred mountain, bringing with them their poets. Seized with joy, they shouted our anthems. We sang again the earth song. We praised them, we praised their wives, we carried their children on our shoulders. We knew then the long promised festival had come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandile Ngiti, for that illuminating discussion on the work of Masisi Kunene. And yes, you know, the role of poetry, I think, you know, when you look at the word in South Africa and where it has grown in terms of how it's become accessible, particularly to a younger audience, I think, you know, when we talk about giants of letters, and giving a new life and exposing these giants of letters to a new younger public, especially considering kind of the gaps in education. I think, you know, a revitalization of this kind of work would have been would be really essential in that regard. But my question for you, Sandile, before we move on, because we've got 5 minutes, is one of the concerns is that perhaps, and in response to the losses that we've experienced as a result of, hello everyone, my video is on now, so now you can see me. Because of the losses that we've experienced as a result of colonization and apartheid, is that how do we avoid the danger of slipping into a kind of essentializing an idyllic pre-colonial past that may not necessarily be the case? How do you navigate through that when you analyze the works of Masisi Kunene, especially a poem like Emperor Shaka the Great?
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful question, Karabo. I love it so much. All of us have ancestors. We go back to ancestors, to the Greeks for philosophy, to the French, to the Germans, to Marx, and so on. So there's a certain idea that when Africans do it, it is backward. So I'm not saying you're saying that, but in general, there is that idea. So what Masisi Kunene does with Emperor Shaka the Great is to dedicate it to the people of Africa, and he sees the importance of Shaka beyond a narrow Zulu nationalism. For him, I mean, Masisi Kunene has said several times, he says, I did not write an epic for the Zulus. I wrote an epic for the peoples of Africa. And he also says that the knowledge systems of Africa, the cultures of Africa are diverse, and he himself cannot at all hope to speak for all of them. But also he's saying the evocation of the past is done in order to animate the present and the future. In other words, it is a gesture that serves progressive, liberatory, and modern imperatives. It is not a hankering after a past that is innocent and without any contradictions. He's fully aware of the contradictions that the past brings to us. But the past is not necessarily a place that we should fear to return to, because we are products of that past, but also we've got the eyes, and every day they get sharpened by the likes of Masisi Kunene for that past to be critiqued and the present to be made better and the future to be made even more better. Thank you.
Thank you. I like what you had to say as well. This idea of sort of cultivating history so that we can create a more desirable future is really important. And I liked what you also had to say about how you know, the poem of Shaka the Great is not about a kind of nationalism, because nationalism is actually a colonial agenda, right? That it's actually more about solidarity among the peoples of Africa. And linking that with the sort of work that we're doing, you know, as you know, from a social science perspective, in terms of research and methodology, is that a lot of our scholars keep warning us that we should resist this kind of methodological nationalism when we think about African identities. and how we look at similarities and differences and rebuilding and activating new kinds of solidarity. So thank you so much for that. And Anele Ngiti says an important figure in our history and discourse is evidently so much more to the man than some of us were aware. Thank you for sharing these insights, Sandile. Thank you. But what are your comments, Sandile, on what I've said about this idea of activating history so that we can imagine a desirable future?
It's brilliant because the South African Academy, because I can start there, and the South African education system, they are complicit in the continued marginalization of Black people as thinkers. They are nowhere to be seen as thinkers, as philosophers, and so on. Because in the world of Marxism, we've got a wide range of subjects that in fact are relevant for our schools today. But you know that if the school system does not have these works, the Mafeges and so on, even universities that claim to be liberal or to be progressive, they are still in that mode that African thinkers matter if they are not from South Africa. And this may sound xenophobic, but I don't mean it in that sense. But I'm talking about the contradictions and the issues, the unresolved business of our liberation, particularly in the academy and the world, of intellectual discourse. Mazisquinen put together an epic of over 300 pages that he had first written in Zulu and then translated into English. If you just do a Google search, hardly anybody is teaching that. And why is that the case? So these are issues that we should not shy away from. These are the new struggles because oppression mutates itself in several ways. And it's not yet Uhuru and the new technologies of oppression, to use, Achille Mbembe's words, that obtain, in our country and beyond. But I think our country is where we should begin. If the likes of Bongani Nyoga and Sipio Mahala are producing biographical works on Mafeje and Ken Temba and so on, why are these works just not being taken seriously? They ought to be taken seriously, and our education system should be one center of activism that we should not run away from, and we must get all the trouble, for that cause. We need some good trouble. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, and that brings to mind also the work of Sabata Mpomukai in terms of celebrating the works of Saul Blackie. It's incredibly important. And yeah, it is incredibly important. And the thing is, the danger when we don't invest in this is that our cultural capital ends up being in the hands of global North universities, where all the archival work is kept there, and the funding of scholarship in this kind of history. Going back to what Dr. Nyoka had said, that then we maintain the status of being Shanghai intellectuals because the work that we produce ends up being kept in archives that are not accessible to our children. And that would not be good for posterity. So we have to move on now to the next part of the program. Thank you so much, Sandile, for all these insights. I've got so many notes and, adding more to a person's library and even going back to rereading things in a different way, because we also impact history as we keep on looking at it. But now I'd like us to move on to discussing power in indigenous languages. And the questions we're going to ask is, what is the role and contribution of authors in the development and the preservation of South Africa's indigenous languages? Are there enough books written or translated to and from indigenous languages? Is there a market? What is the contribution of stakeholders in the book value chain and in government? And, when a language dies, it's probably one of the biggest tragedies for humanity, and we do need to preserve our languages. So to help us in this conversation, unfortunately, Professor Zodwa Moza is not able to join us. They do send their apologies, but we're going to be joined by Lorato Trok, who is an early literacy consultant and expert in developing reading for pleasure. And these are books for young people, young children, especially in African languages. Having more than 20 years experience in publishing, writing, and story development in children's literature, Lorato started her career as a librarian at Robert Moffat Library in her hometown of Kuruman in the Northern Cape. Her other career highlights include being a project coordinator at the Center for the Book in Cape Town, a specialist unit of the National Library of South Africa for the award-winning EB 2004 First Words in Print project. Now, this is a project where children's stories were created with input from publishers in all 11 South African languages and distributed across the country in homes and schools. In 2005, Lorato was invited to help launch Reading Africa program at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in Washington, D.C. And she also worked as a publishing program manager at Room to Read South Africa, which is an American-based NGO. One of the children's books she produced for Room to Read won the prestigious UNICEF Best ECD publication for 2011-2012. She has worked as editor and project manager for schools publishing at Oxford University Press, South Africa, Lesotho, and Zambia country coordinator for the African Storybook Initiative, and her book, Rosina Sidibani Mudiba, A Dream Denied, was selected as one of the 5 United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 5, Gender Equality and Empowerment for All Women and Girls for the UN Africa chapter in December 2021. And if you want to know more about the African Storybook Initiative, you can go to africanstorybook.org. Greetings, Ms. Strock, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Greetings, Karabo. I'm doing very well, thank you. And greetings to everyone.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. And, you know, the book that you wrote on Rosina Sidibani Mudiba, you know, it is so important because this is at the same time that when we think about our past and our childhoods, and you know, the first person we think about is Zolabad. Meanwhile, there's this other person that's closer to us, that looks like us, that shares the similar background to us. And I'm so excited about that story, and I hope that it keeps, you know, it keeps traveling and it grows wings into the future. But what are your thoughts on power in indigenous languages?
Okay, thank you, Karabo, very much. And thank you, ANFASA, for inviting me to this. Let me just say that. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Whose mics are on? Please, everyone, mute your mic if you're not speaking.
I can hear it. I can see Teddy Somasolani's mic is on, or he just muted. Okay. So thank you, Karabo. Right. And let me just say that for the 2 books that I wrote for the young audiences, before I go into this, I just want to thank ANFASA. Actually, I got the grants for both of my non-fiction for young adults biographies from the ANFASA grant, so I'm grateful. So when it comes to the topic of you know, what the contribution of authors in the development and preservation of South Africa's indigenous languages, I'll start by, you know, myself saying that I've been involved in early literacy in indigenous languages for 20+ years, and in various capacities, as a librarian, as a publisher, as a researcher, an author, a creative writing facilitator, and everything else. But for the mere fact that few people know about my work tells you everything that you need to know about how this country views our work in early literacy and in African languages. There is not a lot of investment in both the field that I work in African languages and children's literature, especially from the government. And you know, we always leave out corporate South Africa, and we can't leave it out because it's part of this country and they have a responsibility to contribute to the nation building of this country. So there's a lot of authors that are doing everything they are humanly possible to get their work out there in African languages. But unfortunately, there's no one out there to meet them halfway, especially our government. And we get surprised when we hear of 78% of our children not being able to read in any languages in our country, in their home languages. Why do we get surprised when there's no support for people who write in African languages, and especially authors who write children's literature? Like I do, it's not taken seriously when we write children's literature. It's like, oh, it's one of those. And the mere fact that people think that it's easy to write children's literature is actually the most difficult form of writing, writing for children. It's not easy. It's not putting 1, 2, 3 together and people think that, oh, it's children's literature, they'll understand. When you don't have the privilege of text, like people who write novels and so on, they've got the privilege of text. When you write for children, you do not have the privilege of text, and that makes it even more difficult because you need to get it right from the beginning. And especially when you write in African languages, because you've got to understand those languages and write them as well as you could. So that's where we are at the moment. And the other thing that we are having a challenge with in our country is that unless you are an author of prescribed books, for schools, you are for DBE, because that's where publishers focus on, and that's where the government focus on. As an author of non-fiction, biographies that I write or fiction for children, you are basically on your own. And I will tell you that there are many authors who write in African languages who a lot of publishers or people don't know about them out there because there's no support, because they are not valued as people who write in English. Listen, I've been writing in Setswana for my whole career. And it's only when I started writing my non-fiction biographies in English that people started recognizing me and felt like, I've only just started writing, but I've been an author all these years. And it's only because I was writing in Setswana that no one felt like I was actually a real author. So you are not considered a real author if you write in your home language, only when you start writing in English. And that's like basically what authors do, why they go, the English route as opposed to writing in African languages, because they feel that they are going to be seen and heard when they write in English as opposed to their home languages. But again, when it comes to the issue of education and our children, I mean, there's been so much research that has been done that over and over shows that unless children are taught in languages that they understand, in languages that they speak at home, in languages that they hear daily when they come back from school, we are not going to get it right in our country. And also that unless we flood schools and homes in books that are relevant to the children, that are relevant to their backgrounds, because when you write in a language, you also write the children's background. It's not just writing about the language, you write about their culture, you write about what they understand, you write about what they see. And as a person who writes in the languages that children understand, they also, when they see that the book is written by somebody that understand where they come from, or who not just look like them, but understand exactly what's happening in their lives, then it gets easier for them. But what we have done is we haven't managed to flood our schools, our libraries, and our homes with books for children in African languages, because I don't think that we realize that, or people realize, but they're not doing anything. It's not much. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say they're not doing anything, but not much is being done to ensure that African languages really get the spotlight that they deserve. And there aren't enough books, written or translated, there aren't enough. And then translation is just another issue on its own. Karabo, you must tell me if you still want me to go on. It's another issue on its own, because, translation is Tate Mohapi always goes on about translation. And, translation is a rare skill, if I can say that. It's a very rare skill, but that's not how it's being treated in our country. Publishers, I don't think they've invested enough in translation or in translators. I get sad when I read books in Setswana that have been translated, and you just ask yourself, who thought that this was the right book to publish or to put out there for the children? Our children are being given poison to read in schools because publishers just want to get books in African languages out there without consideration of the quality. And I mean, if you have worked in publishing, you know what publishers put in when it comes to English and Afrikaans. That is not the same when it comes to African languages. They just think that anyone who can speak the language can actually translate, and that is not the case. I always say that, you know, when it comes to translation, translation is not just translation. Translation is what is transcreation. You recreate the story that you are translating into the story of the new constituencies now. You are no longer doing it for the English reading population or the children who read in English. You are recreating the story for the next children, the next language that you are doing for isiZulu, Setswana, and so on. So that is the other challenge. I attended one of the imbizos at the National Library where the Department of Arts and Culture was doing some work that they've done for the Parliamentary Committee on Libraries and so on. And they invited librarians to talk about their work in libraries and about the books, especially African languages. And the librarians were lamenting about the quality of work or the quality of books that they get in their libraries for African languages, and say, it's not like people don't want to read books in African language. It's the quality that gets out there that, you know, we have to do. It's not okay for what we receive. People don't want it because the books have been so badly translated. But you know what? If we can just invest in translation and so on, then we'll get it right. But then here, this is where we are as Puku, because I work with Me'eli Sisulu, and everyone knows she has done tremendous work in early literacy and in African languages, promoting African languages. Puku is the only organization in South Africa that reviews children's books. So Puku reviews children's books in African languages. Any book, whether it has been published through, you know, by commercial publishers or people who self-publish and so on, we review children's books and we put them on the website, because we've got an issue with parents saying that we don't have any books, we can't find any books in bookshops that sell African languages, and we all know that is the case in South Africa, that we can't find books in this bookshops that sells African languages for children and so on. So Puku does that and then puts the reviews up on their website, and the reviews, parents can go up onto the Puku website and check the reviews and so on. So that is the only thing. Then the other thing that, you know, how we are supposed to be doing, supporting authors, is when you go to the Puku YouTube, we do get, you know, people talk about African languages, what they've gone through. So there are resources that can be, people can get through and see what other organizations are doing. Because I think that when we are working in the African languages space, it's like we are not visible. We are not being made visible because it feels like we don't really matter. So I am going to stop here and ask people to go to the Puku website, which is www.puku.co.za, and also go to the Puku YouTube channel and check out what authors are saying there about their books and so on. And also please subscribe to the Puku website, because if you subscribe, then in a way you are promoting African languages authors through your subscription. Thank you, Karabo.
Thank you so much, raising, I mean, this is one of those things. I think everyone in this room, you know, it's a case of preaching to the choir, right? I mean, we know that the research has shown that, you know, one of the reasons why we struggle to innovate as Africans is that our children are not able to learn abstract concepts because you're being taught mathematics in a language that you do not understand, you know, and that's why we're not able to innovate our way out of some of the challenges that we're facing. And in the chat, Zukiso says, this is very sad because I am that author who writes in isiXhosa, 5 books published, 3 of them winning literary awards, 1 even chosen for the EB 2018 Honor Award, but we are told we have to go out and market to schools, which is not easy. Some encouraged me to write in English to get recognition. It's very hard for us. It's buku.co.za Mbonisen in Ndlovu. And Mam Elino Sisulu says, so much truth in this discussion. I am moved and overwhelmed. And the Puku website, the link is there. Someone has put it in the chat. So please go into the chat box if you want to have access to that. And then moving on, let's hear from Dr. David Wamasamela in terms of carrying this discussion forward. He is the author of, I didn't practice this, the Jamuledi and Moswara Auka. You're going to have to help me with this one, Mr. Masamela. And the Ditlabonyane 2012 also compiled an anthology, Daburala in 2014, and his accolades include the Pansal Multilingualism Award, Matthew Miller Longman Award, the Download Prize in a New Coin Poetry Award, and the South African Book Development Council Award. Now, you know, this thing with indigenous languages and, you know, learning in our languages is that when you look at social, at investments in our society, right, in education, even with us growing up, our parents discouraged us from taking indigenous languages at school. First of all, there was the perception that Setswana is difficult. And, you know, if you reinforce that, then it does become difficult. And you think, you know, our languages are just cultural artifacts in terms of, instead of something that's actually living and organic, and that can keep developing and growing, you know? So priority is not given to our languages in terms of even our education and how our children are educated. I mean, the fact that a lot of our children, even to this day, and this is not to say that Afrikaans is not an important language, but most of our kids still need to pass Afrikaans in order to get a bachelor's pass for matric, to go into university, because the quality of the teaching of the indigenous languages is simply not good enough in their schools. So, you know, it just in terms of the political will, even within our society, around prioritizing indigenous language and indigenous language development, careers for kids. You know, if you want to be a Setswana teacher or you want to teach in Setswana, where are you going to go study at university? You know, in terms of learning how to be an educator and how it's taught. You know, so even the curriculum in terms of education training at higher education, I think it's one of the poorer areas. When you look at universities and how much they invest in different areas of research. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in that regard. But Dr. David Wamasamela, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this topic, and I will read more of your chats after you make your presentation. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Sis Karabo. I think I like your input, which ties very well with the question that you posed earlier on to Brasandile about the pre-colonial image that we have and its viability. Firstly, I think as a point of departure, we need to admit that, and this is one point you once emphasized in one event elsewhere. We need to admit that we are at the point where we are not only captured in a foreign linguistic landscape, but we are also foreign to our own linguistic landscape. So we are in a juncture where one can say we are more of linguistic orphans, because that which we have as the only is not home. It's just a make-do kind of an arrangement. And that which we long for, that which we advocate for, is also not home enough, because
when you encounter purists, they will tell you, Karabo, we don't pronounce it this way, we pronounce it that way. No, Karabo, we don't write it this way. And that space that is supposed to be home also to you, it's still even worse than that borrowed home, because at least with English you can make do, but when you go back to Setswana, Sepedi, Sizulu, and so forth, sometimes you find that the gap is so vast that it's a foreign world. Why am I saying that? We need to be sober in our adventure. We need to understand that much as we need our languages to be mainstreamed, we also need learning material for us to go back to our languages and have such command that we have perhaps, or we think we have in other languages, also in our own languages. So that is the dilemma that we find ourselves in, and it's nothing new. I like the work of poet T.S. Eliot. He mentioned how the elite poets usually will, or the elite scholars and so forth, will usually promote and advance the need of reading the indigenous authors, which is not to say they do that. When you go to their spaces, you will find them holding books in other languages. But when they have podiums such as this, they will tell you one story. Eliot also, the topic of our roundtable is around the role and or should I just say the function of a writer. Eliot advised us that we should be careful. There are two roles of a writer. One is the role that people, when they discuss, they speak about what they think the writer ought to do, which is more theoretical. And then the other one is what the authors are doing, have been doing, which is more practical. So I would like to speak about the latter, but also tying up to what Brasandile was saying about our giants. Masisi Kunene is one of the giants who was vocal about the role of African languages. And in one book, he said, in the future, I quote, in the future, the greatest literature to emerge from South Africa will be a literature written by Africans in African languages. In fact, I am sure of it. So this quote of Kunene is a litmus test for me. I'm asking myself whether are we anywhere closer to the future Kunene was referring to. And my answer will be no. And worse, in other languages, we are even far from that future than when Masisi Kunene uttered or wrote those words. And why am I saying that? We keep on day in, day out, seeing and hearing of publishing houses which are closing the Department of African Languages. We see universities closing Department of African Languages. We also see very strategic organizations such as the South African Book Development Council, which has done something that is so unmatched. I was fortunate that one of my books was published through that one of their programs. And what they did not just create a platform, they even went to the quality and say, how do we change
the quality of books that are written in our African languages. Now, when you see such organization closing down, it's telling you a lot. Last year, around September, we took a field trip to Kenya and Tanzania. And it was so heartbreaking to learn that at the University of Nairobi, where the likes of Ngungis and Tabenlo Lyongs were fighting to ensure that there is a department for literature in Kiswahili, that department is finally placed under linguistics. So you don't have anymore a standalone Kiswahili department. And now you ask yourself, where are we in the continent when you think on one side, the Magafuris are doing a lot in positioning Kiswahili as a Pan-African language. Then you realize that in practicality, we are taking steps backward. And it also ties back to the first presentation that we had, because we over-rely on funders, and in turn, funding will determine who we are. Back in South Africa, one thing which colonists have done so well is to tie our languages into what Sestrock was talking about, prescription for school syllabus or curriculum. And now we know that outside leisure, you hardly find, outside education, you hardly find our books available there. And if they do, they rely on funding which does not always come without conditions. So now, the next question that is on the topic is about the influence of writers to the preservation of our languages. T.S. Eliot has said also, as part of the theory, something interesting, which I think it is also relevant to our situation. He said, the linguistic landscape influences the literary output, and in turn, the literary output will influence the linguistic landscape. So we cannot speak about the role of literature to the preservation of language without talking about language itself conducive enough, the use of language conducive enough for that literature to prosper. For literature to prosper, you need readers, you need users of the language. And it goes back to the question of language use. Are we using our languages enough? And Sis Karabo, I have realized that many of us are even more fluent when they are reading text in any other language, particularly English, than when they read in their mother tongue. And if we don't address that, because the exercise of reading needs to be delightful, it needs to be pleasure. So if reading work in my mother tongue is more like a punishment, as Peter Horn will put it, then that is where we should be working more on. And it also says writers alone cannot change or solve this problem, because you need the entire community, you need the village, you need the teachers to do their work, but you more so need the parents to do their work. If parents are continuing talking to their children in English at home and thinking that is progress, which is not to say it's wrong, but they should be aware of the outcome. And the outcome is this space that we find ourselves, where we are more foreign to our mother tongues, to our heritage languages, to our African indigenous languages than we are to the imposed or borrowed or loaned language. So my take is we have to clearly work together. There is scarcity of funding, that is, it goes without saying. There are challenges in the publishing industry because it's business, and we also need that business sector to play its part. So towards my conclusion, do we have enough books? Absolutely no. And that is if you are looking at the ratio of the speakers of these languages vis-a-vis the books that we have on the shelves. And on the others are not on the shelves, so they are in booths, in whatever. So the journey is still way far from the Masisi Kunene vision. But that said, we should also admit that the level of consciousness is now growing even further. We have seen with the new movements that are emerging from universities, there is an emphasis on the importance of languages, our languages, and whether it will be something that will be achieved today or tomorrow or many, many years to come, but one is hopeful because that consciousness is growing. And we just heard here on the platform, we have many writers who have written either manuscripts and published books. So that is hope. Obviously, that hope needs to be matched with opportunities in order to ensure that the dream is realized. My conclusion then becomes translation. I'm going to answer it on two folds. Yes, we need translation. Yes, no one can downplay the role of translation. But I think before I enter into my take, we need to be careful that before we speak about translation, we still have a serious deficit of books written in our languages. So we know that it is important to speak to the outside world, but we need to acknowledge that we as a world, we are not talking to each other. And we need to put more emphasis in publishing books. Then when we have sufficient material, we will speak about translation. And why am I saying that? We can take a good example in the economic landscape with South Africa and maybe China relations, where you cut the tariffs for each other as business deals. But because China is not just producing products, but it is producing machines that produce products. In a short period of time, China will bring more goods to that country, to South Africa, than South Africa can do to China. And translation for me is also that. Translation is about linguistic power. Whether you like it or not, at most, it is about a superior language wanting to know what is happening in what is regarded as a senior language, or at least in the South African history. That is how translation has been used. We know the apartheid regime has kept on owning that space, whether through translation and also the book publishing industry itself was owned by most of the books in Sotho, Setswana, Sepedi were published by the likes of Afrikaans Publishing Company, and part of the board members of those were the leaders of that time, the Smarts and so forth, because they understood the power of language as they did to Afrikaans, and they understood that if you speak to people in your language, they will have them, what Mandela explained very well, that you'll be speaking to their hearts. So they needed to control that which is published through those languages. But having said that, there are small drops of successes. I was personally part of the project by the Oxford University in partnership with the University of the Western Cape under the coordination of Prof. N.T. Grok, and that series, the Africa Pulse, I think, it published 8 African classics, the translation. This include books by the Vilagazis and Mutais and OK Matsepes, and I really admire that effort. But this is something that I think it should not prioritize beyond the actual writing, because we have not exhausted our pool, our wealth of literary gems. I mean, in Sepedi, my PhD project was on the poetry of Petros Molelemani and Johannes Mohlala. And these people are unknown. They have not published anything. Their work is still in the oral form. But in my assessment, they are the best of what I ever encountered in the literary landscape, meaning even today, as we celebrate our giants, we should be sober enough to know that those that we regard as our giants today are not absolute, are not all-encompassing. There are many literary giants which are forgotten, which are neglected, which are not even counted as writers, for instance, because especially in poetry, people who are good, I mean, let's talk about the poet of the king. Those are poets which are under-researched. Yes, it's good to work on the works of the known Mgunenes, Khositiles, and the Serotas of this country, but there are also writers who, or poets whose role is direct to the society. And when you look at the incident that took place during the will reading of the succession at the Zulu Royal Kingdom, you realize that these are poets who do not wait to be called to the stage. They continue playing their role, but is their role counted when we speak about the role of poets? And that is the last point that I will take from Eliot, who says we should be careful that when we discuss literature and poetry, we should not limit ourselves to the famous poets. We should know that there are many other poets who are ignored, and much as we give them attention, we should give all attention. So I thank you so much, Sis Karabo. That is my 5 cents. Thank you. You are still muted, Sis Karabo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Those salient points, you know, the issue with indigenous languages is something that's really, really close to my heart. It's deeply personal, right? Because when you look at sort of prioritizing, you know, we want our children to succeed. We want them to have a chance to have, you know, decent lives in the future. So how do we prioritize what they get to learn, right? And this is something that personally I had to be intentional about, because I was raised in a way that alienated me from my language, and it also has spiritual consequences, right? Because how do you even reconnect spiritually with yourself if your inner world, the world of your dreams, speaks a language that is foreign to you? It's incredible. So I mean, it's one of those things that I was very intentional about in terms of raising my own child, that I would raise them with their paternal grandmother, where you leave English at the gate when you enter the household. You leave English at the gate, and the way I see how that has led to even the development and the psychological well-being of this child, because they are not alien to themselves. And there's been a huge movement among younger people in South Africa that I'm really starting to admire, where they are learning to reconcile with their spiritual selves and their spiritual world histories and family histories through language as well. And I think it's really important that sort of we bring that back, because we are not just physical and intellectual beings, we are spiritual beings. And part of the agenda to actually, you know, to destroy our way of being and to keep us in perpetual subjugation is to also alienate ourselves from our spiritual histories, and doing that through languages is an incredibly powerful way. That's why, you know, when you speak the language of people, you speak to their hearts, but you're also gathering intelligence. So I do understand why you're saying we should be a little bit circumspect when it comes to translation, and focus on developing the originating work first, because we do know that the agenda of translation historically and from an anthropological perspective was, you know, let's understand the psyche of these people so we can know how to subjugate. Well, let me go to your chats and everyone's feedback in the chats. And Zukiso says, I think as Africans, we are facing a bigger problem, because yes, we need readers of the African languages, the home language, but we send our children to schools that do not teach or accommodate African languages. There may be valid reasons for doing that, but on the other hand, it is somehow killing our mother tongues. The children can speak the language at home, but they can't read or write. And okay, Mam Eleanor has said, please email your book information to the administrator at Buku. Zodumo says it's also quite true that learning in mother tongue is the best, and yet our various education systems and content deprive the majority of African children, youth, and adults of this benefit. Learning in mother tongue speaks to better understanding, self-esteem, relatable content, and feeling at home, amongst other countless benefits. And Sandile also agrees, Sandile Ngiti agrees that languages speak to our spirituality as well. Your language is your identity. And Datemo Happy says we need African Languages Summit and not just talk. It is, you know, it is important, and we need to bring in people from different sectors of society, because, you know, we have to move on because we're running out of time. And I would really like to hear what Professor Ngubane has to say in this regard, because, yeah, I mean, this issue of indigenous languages, you know, because it is about connecting people, and it's about success, and it is about power. Ultimately, it is about power. If you own people's consciousness, then you can do whatever you want with them. So Professor Ngubane, I'd love to hear your presentation about power in indigenous languages. Please go ahead. Thank you. Ma'am Eleanor, before we speak to Professor Ngubane, I see that your hand was up. What would you like to contribute to this discussion, Ma'am Sisulu?
Yes, I just want to contribute 2 practical suggestions. You know, the point about getting people to read, especially young people, I really want to propose a graphic novel project presenting the works of greats like Mazisi Kunene, Njolobe, all the literary greats in all the languages, because the National Library of South Africa did classic works and they translated them, but there hasn't been that much of an uptake. And I really believe that if we produce graphic novels, there'll be more interest. And also I really appreciated what David said about just the register, that we can't be, you know, the isiZulu of Eshowe for children in Soweto. It's not going to work. And I think graphic novels offers the possibility to explore that in languages. Other thing I want to point out, and we'll get back to ANFASA on this, that we'll be inviting ANFASA members. We're working on a big project within the next 3-4 years to have catalogs in every single language for ECD and foundation phase for our children. And these are catalogs backed by extensive reviews. We're doing this in partnership with National Library, UNISA, and we want to bring on other partners. And I think ANFASA must be an important partner in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Eleno Sisulu, and everyone's in agreement. It is a brilliant idea to have graphic novels. I think, you know, and it's about stimulating the imagination, right? Because even when you think about ideas of literacy and how children learn, you know, because of the demands of technology, even the written word is undergoing a transformation, and we don't have enough scientists to actually sort of flesh out how far that is going, and how that will, you know, how that will affect learning in the future. So incorporating different ways in which children can have access to their inner world through language can also be by using the visual. So thank you for that input. Professor Ngubane, what are your thoughts on this issue of power in indigenous languages?
Thank you very much, Karabo, for steering this conversation and discussion this morning. And I do want to acknowledge and welcome the speakers that have spoken before me. And I think we could not have chosen the best speakers as the ones that have spoken today. And I appreciate, I was also fascinated to hear Uhlomu Gasandile citing our great hero, Ubaba Umazisi Kunene, Professor Kunene, who was my colleague at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, uMatisi Kamtsabuli wekunene. Thank you very much, and David and the rest of the speakers. I think my intention when we host these conferences is to sit back and listen to other great minds addressing us. But I think today, I don't know how some did it, that I also make a contribution to the discussion. I wish I would leave my English before I address you and speak in my own mother tongue, which is isiZulu. But I know that if I speak in isiZulu, very few people will be challenged to hear what I'm trying to converse. But I think what Karabo has said, that we need to encourage our young ones, our children, to speak in our languages, because the only solution to preserve and develop our languages is to use them. We have such an act that promotes using or usage of languages that we keep on ignoring, because if we don't use our languages will not develop. So I think we need to revitalize our languages and rethink our languages and take our languages seriously. And we must write in our own languages. We must talk in our own languages. And I think we also need a lingua franca, which is not English, that will cut across all 9 indigenous languages in South Africa. Because it sometimes poses a challenge when I speak isiZulu, trying to communicate my ideas with a Venda speaking person, a Sotho speaking person. At least Southern Sotho, there is a little intelligibility. I can hear some people when they talk in Southern Sotho. But I think if we can have a language which does not have a speech community or its own speakers like Kiswahili, which is indigenous in Africa, it will help us that we learn our own languages, which is, like in my case, this is Zulu. We learn English and we learn Kiswahili. So if we've got two lingua francas, English and Kiswahili, we'll be able to communicate our dear. Indigenous languages of South Africa, they form an important part of knowledge production and use chain. The development and sustenance of language-based economy relies on their ability to facilitate the accessibility. There was one case where a Sotho speaker was addressing a Xhosa speaker. He said, "Ke a o tseba mrena." And the Xhosa felt offended by that statement. And in response to the statement, a Xhosa man said, "Sobe untsibe." I'm sure people who understand both languages will understand where the challenge was of a language communication breakdown. When you say tsiba in Sesotho, you say, "I know you." But when you say tsiba in Xhosa, you're saying, "I can jump you." In other words, we are too short that I can jump you. So that is why they ended up in a big fight. This Xhosa speaking man saying, you see, that kind of a challenge poses a challenge to us as the speakers of these indigenous languages. Usability of knowledge and information should be able to permeate knowledge in society. Authors are core in the knowledge production chain, and they are also central to the creation of new ideas. Indigenous languages is very crucial and fundamental to their ability to communicate and get their literal messages, expressions, and ideas and thoughts. Opting to write in indigenous languages bring along its cultures, history, identities, and indigenous knowledge that exists through our own personal wisdom. We have wisdom within our languages. One is tempted to cite proverbs. Proverbs are very rich in our languages. When I say, "Ayikho indlovu eyasindwa umboko wayo," those who understand isiZulu will know what I mean. That we need to be capable in meeting our needs like an elephant. So writing in indigenous languages may be translated into a difference between the growth and the demise of a language in a society in terms of its culture and civilization. When we speak English, we become more civilized than when we use our own languages, because the extent to which we express ourselves in a foreign language marks, we are being viewed as intelligent. And when we speak our own languages, then we feel that we are inferior and we cannot compete in the conversations and dialogues of significance. And also, I'm fascinated by the way we speak English using our indigenous languages influence. I was in a meeting this morning where a speaker was referring to a zebra. And when you say zebra, it's because of that E, which is pronounced E. And yet in isiZulu, that E is E. So most African people will say zebra, zebra, instead of zebra. So our young children and grandchildren will laugh at us when you say zebra. So this is just one of the examples that we also feel that we cannot express ourselves in English because of the influence and the background of our mother tongues. Many languages in South Africa are struggling to survive because of various reasons, including neglect by its own writers and publishers. Both publishers and African writers play a major role in the knowledge production and may elevate the promotion and the preservation of our languages in South Africa. Preservation of indigenous languages is a repository of African values and cultures and our own personal and traditional belief systems. So this will ensure that South Africa's knowledge economy develops without sidelining any culture or any language. We find that our own cultures are being marginalized by ourselves when we start writing, because we have lived under the wrong premise that our cultures are inferior to the Western cultures. So that fear of inferiority or the inferiority complex prevents us in writing about our own personal experiences in our own languages and prefer to write in English at the expense of our African languages. And if we do so and write in English, we get more readership than when we write in our own languages, because our history tells us that African authors use writing for educational material. So we write for schools, we don't write for leisure. And therefore, the level of readership of our own indigenous book is minimal, and it is limited to the school children. And the school children read them for their assessment purposes. They don't just read them for leisure. So we need to revisit and rethink the status of our own languages. And my plea to you, ladies and gentlemen, and our distinguished guests, I'm so pleased I see many names of people that I know here in the audience. My plea is that all role players must try to make an effort to revitalize and empower indigenous languages in South Africa. And no one else will empower our languages if we sit back and do nothing about it. We've been talking about the promotion of indigenous languages. It is now about time that we start acting towards promoting our languages. Libraries can also contribute to the preservation and development and promotion of indigenous languages. There was an effort by the National Library to revive all the classic works and to do translation. Most speakers have spoken about translation. I won't dwell on the translations, but there are works of famous pioneers in writing. I'll just cite the authors of isiZulu, like we have Dr. B.W. Vilakazi, who wrote a very famous poem, Ezinkopolo, depicting the life of African people in the mines. And there's also other poem by B.W. Vilakazi, which says, Mlungu, ungazikhohlisi. All those are classics because they address the situation and the struggle of the African people during the period of apartheid, where books that were written in isiZulu were censored and you could not write as you like. You will write and it will be scrutinized and it will be censored before it is published. So we have books by Mazisi Kunene. Most of these books are lying on the shelves and they are gaining dust. No African children are keen to read them. Even the African intellectuals are not keen to read their own books. I'm referring to this initiative by the National Library because there are so many books that were reprinted. Unyenyeza Eskoteni, Masehambisane by Professor Nyembezi, and many of them. So I think if we can revisit those initiatives and bring back the classic, there was a question of availability of indigenous books. We've got plenty books that we write, plenty books that are written. I've written plenty books that I think only 3 books that I've written in my whole life have been prescribed to schools. But otherwise, I've got copies. There are copies that are gaining dust. No one is prepared or is interested in reading. So I think let's make our own books written in our own indigenous languages available for our children to read. The issue of translation of books from other languages. When you translate a book from a foreign language, it doesn't carry the same weight and the tone to the translated version. Sandile will recall that there is a publisher from England who published Inkinsele yaseMgungundlovu by Sibusiso Nyembezi, the late Professor Nyembezi. And the title itself, Inkinsele yaseMgungundlovu, was translated into A Rich Man of Peter Marisbeck. You see, the weight that is carried by Inkinsele. Inkinsele is not just an ordinary rich man. Maybe you could even say Impunyela. Impunyela is not very strong in the language of isiZulu. But when I say Inkinsele, like the main character Ndebenkulu used to address himself or identify himself, says, I'm an esquire. Maybe if they say the esquire of Peter Marisbeck, it will come closer to the original meaning of the word Inkinsele. So sometimes we lose the cultural variance and the weight and the tone of the word once we translate it. So books must be translated by people who understand both languages so that they cannot just translate word by word, but they can take the sense from the source language to the target language. So I think one needs to be careful when we translate these books. So as ANFASA, we have been always empowering authors. To this end, ANFASA have introduced a grant scheme where we encourage young and upcoming authors to apply for this grant. It's not much, but it's in the range of 20,000, 15 to 20,000. But this grant kickstart writing, because you can do a research before you write your book, whether it is fiction or non-fiction book, and you could make a start. We have published many books so far, over 36 books that have been published through this grant scheme. And I would like to invite people who are interested to apply. We will make a call later in around October. And I think this is one way of not sitting back and talking about promotion of languages, but doing something to promote African languages. And this we have been granted funding to promote writing indigenous books by the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, which we are grateful. And I saw that there is Lisa Combrick in the audience. We are grateful for this opportunity because what we are planning to do is to go through the entire South Africa, right in the deep rural areas, to reach out to people who have never published before. And we are prepared to upskill those people and motivate and train them to write any book, fiction book, from novels and short stories and essays. And at the end, the outcome of this project is for us to have books that will be published. So the other thing that is also a challenge is that sometimes we produce manuscript and we look for publishers to publish our manuscript. And it's always a hassle to get relevant publishers to publish African or language works. So maybe we'll find a good summer return from publishing houses to publish our manuscript, because I think this is going to become a flagship for ANFASA. And we are hoping that we will launch the first books that will be around March next year. So we are doing something as ANFASA, and the conferences of this nature is also one of the ways of reacting towards the promotion of indigenous languages. And we are grateful today that we have such powerful speakers. And on that note, I would like to stop here, because the whole purpose of this exercise was to encourage discussion. So not the panelists should speak for 5 minutes and 6 minutes, and then we open up for discussion. So I think I have spoken long, but I'm grateful that we have this platform where we can connect our minds and come up with resolutions that will see our indigenous languages elevated to greater heights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ngubane. And we're going to have that conversation. We will have a general discussion after we speak to earning a living as an author, as well as reflections on the power of authors. But thank you so much for all of those insights. And looking at the time now, we are going to take a comfort break for 10 minutes. We'll go into earning a living as an author, and then we will have the conversation about everything that we've discussed and that our presenters have brought forth. But before we take that quick break, Sandy, I see you'd like to say something? Your hand's up.
You can wait for the break, my dear sister.
All right, so we will be back at 11:30 to resume with earning a living as an author, and then we'll have that conversation. So enjoy the quick break, and I will see you in a bit.
Hey.
Welcome back, everyone. And yes, the power of authors, the second annual discussion by ANFASA, which is a really important conversation and conference to have. And yes, so we're going to continue with the final sort of panel, which is about earning a living as an author, because we do not survive on fresh air. And claiming the right to earn an income and exploring the ways of strengthening income is going to be the theme of this discussion. Authors are creators of knowledge, and their creation has economic value. Rather than asking if authors can make a living from their work, the question is the role that authors play adequately rewarded? What is the status of the author in society? And speaking to this, somebody said on Twitter earlier, said the royalties from his books of poetry up this year from minus 83 Rand to 0 Rand. And, you know, it would be funny if it wasn't so heartbreaking. That means that people have to do other things. And we know that if you're trying to survive, then the quality of your work is adversely impacted. So in order to have this conversation and to take it forward, we'll be speaking to Sihle Khumalo and Peter Schneider. I don't know if Melika Abdel Mumen is here yet. I'm struggling to see them in the room, but let me introduce Sihle Khumalo, who is South Africa's award-winning and best-selling author, has written 4 books and contributed to 2. His book, Almost Sleeping My Way to Timbuktu, won the 2014 South African Literary Award for the creative non-fiction category. He was educated at the Durban University of Technology, as well as at Wits and Stellenbosch Business Schools. And his next book will be published in September 2022. Sihle, welcome to you. I hope you're ready to give your presentation and to give us some input into how you're able to make a living, earn a living as an author. And what are your thoughts in this regard? You may go ahead, take it away.
Good morning, Garabo, and very good morning to my fellow panelists. I must say, yes, indeed, I've written 4 books, and by the way, 2 of those were through the grant system or the grant scheme that Professor was talking about that ANFASA gave to me. So I would really appreciate if people would spread the word so that other individuals as well can apply, so that maybe they will never know, they might get an opportunity to get a grant so that they can start their writing career. Now, to the business of the day. Is the role that authors play adequately rewarded? We are not the first people to deal with this issue. There are others before us that have dealt with this issue adequately, I think, and they did not just talk about it. I think it's very important that they came up with solutions, and I really believe and I hope that the session today will do exactly that we just do not talk about this, but we also come up with solutions and how we take this conversation forward. Now, let me put the issues into context. As an author, generally speaking, you earn your income through the point of sale. In other words, your book sells, and then a certain percentage accrues to you. And then in a couple of months, you'll get your royalties. So that's the first part. And obviously, if you're self-published, there is a markup that you'll put onto the price. But the bottom line here is there is that point of sale. So if there are no sales, it becomes very, very difficult for you as an author. Now, a question has to be asked. What happens in a case where your book ends up in a public library? In other words, any person, anybody can access that book, can take it out, read it over a couple of days, bring it back in, another community member then comes through, takes the very same book, takes it out, reads it, and so it goes. So over a period of time, you can just see how many people read your book. But then as an author, you only receive payment once. That point of sale only happened once. So that is the issue at hand here, is once your book gets into the library, as an example, there are so many other individuals, other people who have access to your book and they benefit. And yet you as an author only benefited once from a point of sale perspective. So that's the first thing that we have to keep in mind. The second issue, again, South African context, is we have a very small market as far as book sales is concerned, especially general books. To put things into perspective, your book only has to sell about 5,000 copies, as an example, for it to be classified as a bestseller. And for fiction, the bar is even lower. And this must be understood, the 5,000 copies must be understood within the context of a population of more than 60 million. So that again highlights this issue of an incredibly small market. Now, going back to the question, is the role that authors play adequately rewarded? As I said earlier on, there were other individuals that have dealt with exactly the same issue. And after long deliberations, they came up with, as an example, something that I would like us to talk about in detail, is the public lending right. In other words, once your book gets to the library and somebody loans the book, takes it out in order to go and read it, what if there is some money that accrues to you as an author? That's what public lending right is. And I'm very happy that as part of this conversation, we have a person from Canada where they've successfully implemented this system. Now, if you look at public lending right as an example, the first country to implement this scheme or this system goes back to 1946, believe it or not. And then the following year, it was also implemented in another country. So Denmark was the first country in 1946 to effectively implement the public lending right scheme, followed by Norway the following year in 1947. And currently there are about 35 countries, as far as I'm aware, that have effectively implemented this public lending right scheme. Now, ANFASA, of which I'm part of, has taken this monumental responsibility, obviously working with other stakeholders, in spearheading the introduction of this public lending rights scheme in South Africa. Because as I said earlier on, that is our point of departure, is as things stand, number one, you've got a very small market and you only get to earn a living, or you only get an income through the point of sale. So you need to diversify the income streams. So this is where the issue of public lending rights scheme comes in. I must say again, a vast majority of these countries, 35 countries that has successfully implemented the public lending rights scheme, have done so through legislative framework. In other words, there came a time where the country decided from now on we're going to have PLR. And they came up with legislation that stated exactly that. More often than not, this country started with a Copyright Act, which will then mention PLR. And then in time, they ended up with a standalone PLR Act. I must also say in South Africa, our Copyright Act does not mention PLR. And even the current Copyright Amendment Bill does not even mention PLR. So from a legislative framework perspective, you can just imagine how long it will take to implement PLR in South Africa if we were to follow the legislative framework, because it just takes time to create legislation. I must also add that the mere fact that you've got PLR scheme in your legislation does not necessarily mean overnight you might have PLR. As an example, there are other countries, most of them in the African continent, that already have legislation which mentions PLR. And those countries include Malawi and Kenya. But as far as I'm aware, they've not been able, as things stand, to implement PLR. So it will be very interesting to hear from Peter from Canada with regards to how they've been able to do this, to implement PLR without necessarily a legislative framework, which seemingly might be the option that we in South Africa might have to follow. I must say, obviously, we are still at the very infancy of this. It's going to be a long journey, but this is just part and parcel, I guess, of re-looking at the ways that the author can make a living out of the work that he produces, because we all agree that authors are creators of knowledge, and yet at the same time, why must it be that an author must have other things that he does and cannot just merely live from the fact that he's producing books? So that is why I would like our conversation, yes, to talk about that, but also look at solutions. What is it that needs to be done in order to ensure that the creators of knowledge are well rewarded by the society, in order to ensure that people can actually make a living out of writing books? So the first thing that I've spoken about is public lending, right? The PLR scheme. And I must also say that, again, just another issue that other countries are also looking at, because we must not just look at South Africa. Some of the questions that we are dealing with, some of the challenges that we are facing, other authors globally have had to deal with exactly the same issue. And we have to look at how did they overcome such things? What solutions did they come up with, so that we don't end up reinventing the wheel? As I've just said, public lending rights scheme has been in operation in other countries since the 1940s. I mean, in other words, by the time some of us were born, other countries already had an effective system where they were rewarding their authors. So besides the public lending right, another thing that I came across a couple of months ago, some of you might have heard about it, it's called author share. In simple terms, remember the point of sale. Again, we're going to point of sale. Somebody buys your book, okay, you will get a certain percentage of a net price. But what if that person then decides, okay, I've read this book, now I don't need it, so what if I want to sell it? And then you've got this bookshops which are mainly focused on second-hand books. That is what author share is all about. It's about people who, once your book is being bought by another person, a certain percentage again accrues to you, so that it's not only when your book is bought for the first time that something accrues to you. So when your book is sold by the second-hand bookshop, something again accrues to you to another. So those are two of some of the solutions that have come up in other countries. And I think I'll stop there for now, so that we can hear what they've been doing in Canada, and they've been doing it so effectively. And what is it that we can learn from them, especially because they do not have the legislative framework. I think that is very important for us here in South Africa, because we appreciate that how long it will take for us to have PLR in the legislation. That will take years. So what has made it so successful in Canada? I think for now, Karabo, if you do not mind, I'll stop here and maybe give it over to, or hand it over to Peter in Canada. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Siche. And yes, I mean, Michael has just posted something in the chat about needle time, how that works in the music industry, and whether the publishing industry in South Africa could not approach something like that. Before we go to Peter shortly, just note that we've had to, because of time, we've just changed the running order of things a little bit. We'll end this discussion at 12:15, and then we'll have the conversation from 12:15 to 12:30, where we will take your thoughts on all the conversations that we've had. And Sandile, I do have you on as the first person who will give some input into this conversation. And then Lisa Combrink will give the reflections on the power of authors, and Monica Siba will give the closing address. But yes, Peter Schneider, who has served as the manager and executive secretary to Canada's Public Lending Right Commission since 2012, he leads a dedicated team who deliver the PLR program under the auspices of the Canada Council for the Arts in Ottawa. And he has delivered detailed reports about the evolution and progress of the Canadian PLR program at numerous international conferences, including in Dublin, The Hague, Paris, and London. Now, the Canadian PLR program is overseen by the 15-member Public Lending Right Commission, which is a permanent advisory board which brings together the expertise and guidance of authors, translators, librarians, publishers, and government representatives from both the English and French language communities. Peter, thank you so much for making time for us this afternoon in South Africa. Well, almost afternoon, but still in the morning in Canada. Please go ahead and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll leave my camera on, but if it gets a bit choppy, I'll turn it off for bandwidth, but I'll try to keep my face on screen so I can say hello. And thank you so much for the invitation to join you and to share with you today some perspectives on the Canadian PLR. And thank you as well for inviting our chair, Melika Abdoumouman, who sends her regrets. Her mother is quite ill and she's been called to her family home to take care of her mom on very short notice. So Melika will not be joining me today. I want to start by saying that I'm joining you from Ottawa, Canada, which is the administrative capital of Canada. And the real name of this place is Odawe. Odawe means to trade. And we are located in Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territory and land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And in Canada, we are maturing and going through a moment of profound reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and languages. And it's been so valuable for me and so important to listen to all of the conversations this morning, because there is such a resonance with what we're doing in Canada and what we're doing with PLR in Canada for authors and with libraries. So many of the conversations have an echo and a resonance over here. I'll give you a bit of an overview of the Canadian PLR. We do not have PLR, public lending right, in Canada enshrined in our Copyright Act or in national legislation. Canada adopted PLR in 1986. It came at a moment just before the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed, and the government of the day worked with advocacy groups, worked with writers who worked from a grassroots campaign level over many decades to create a PLR, a public lending right program, to compensate Canadian authors, translators, illustrators, photographers for their contributions to library books across a wide array of literary genres, including scholarly works and nonfiction. It came together quite quickly, and there wasn't time to do national legislation. It was done instead as what is known as a memo to cabinet, like a cabinet memo from the Minister of Communications. And the funding for the program was allocated to the organization I work for, which is the Canada Council for the Arts, which is an arm's length cultural funding body, sort of at arm's length from the political government, but still an agency of the Canadian government here in Ottawa. It's a really good point, the question about what are the challenges that we've faced with the public lending right program in Canada and the Commission without having a PLR Act or guiding legislation. We're incredibly fortunate in Canada to have this Canada Council, this arts funding body, which has been the home of the lending right program and has provided the administrative support to the Commission. And we've also been really fortunate that when they created the lending right program in 1986, it mandated the creation of a stakeholder board, which brings together authors, translators, librarians, and publishers from both the English and French language communities of Canada. And the board has continued to evolve and mature so that we now have representation of Indigenous cultures on the Public Lending Right Commission as well, authorship and perspectives on Indigenous languages. This is really important because my best recommendation or my observation for a country that's beginning its PLR journey, and it is a journey, it's a journey of many decades to get there, is that you need to build a coalition of stakeholders, of champions that involve not only the authorship communities, but progressive librarians who understand the social mission of libraries and the crucial and critical role that libraries can play in language recovery, cultural recovery and retention, democratization of culture and access to culture, free enjoyment of culture. And publishers, of course, who are the agents who take the work of creators and make it available and refine it and place it to market. That's been the formula for success in Canada, where you've brought together, in our case, the librarians, publishers, authors, and translators from both the English and French language speaking communities, and now from Indigenous communities, to defend the program, to protect the program through constant promotion and campaigning and public advocacy. The key question, of course, with lending rights and with libraries is who pays? Who pays for the lending right payments to authors? We're fortunate in Canada in that it's a parliamentary allocation. The writers' groups were able to lobby for a program fund to be set up and administered through a government agency so that the libraries are not responsible for paying a royalty or tithe from their operating budget. I've just received a question in the chat about how the money works. Like how does the payment scheme work? In Canada, it's an annual payment that's calculated based on an annual survey of library holdings. So we don't actually look at loans in Canada. Other countries do. The lending right will look at loans. But in Canada, we simply want to know if a library, a public library, has a title in its collection that is exposed and available for free public use. In other words, that someone's creative work or intellectual property has been exposed in the library to free use where there would not otherwise be compensation. So what we do is an annual electronic survey using the ISBN, the 13-digit serial number. We compare the registrations from authors in our database with the holdings of more than 35 now. It's 35 library systems across the provinces and territories of Canada. Our payments are not based on royalties. They're not based on the overall number of loans or bestseller status of a title. The payments begin at the level of 50 Canadian, $50 annually per author Canadian, which is the equivalent of 625 Rand. The maximum payment, so if we think of a very well-established author, a quite famous author, say Margaret Atwood is someone that is well known around the world, would receive a maximum payment of 4,500 Canadian dollars, which is the equivalent of 56,000 Rand. So it's an appreciable sum. It helps people with their annual incomes and revenues to receive this much money. The average payment is around 6,000 Rand annually, which is the equivalent of about $800 Canadian. We have 20,000 people now registered after 35 years in PLR. We've recently opened the program as well to audiobook recordings and narrators of audiobooks and authors of stories that have been adapted for audio. Self-publishing in Canada has always been eligible for PLR. So since the very beginning of the program in the 1980s, self-published titles have been completely eligible for registration and participation in the program. And we see that as a strength of the program in terms of democratization of production and culture. And with the caveat that in order to be paid, those self-published titles must have been acquired and cataloged by a public library somewhere across the country. So there's much production happening from self-published authors, but in order to receive the revenue from the lending right program, we have to find evidence of the book in a public collection, that a library's acquired the book out of the interests of their own community. And in Canada, as in other places, more and more our public libraries are using community-led development for their collections. And in the earlier times, let's say that the librarians shaped culture by trying to pick out the books that they felt were the most elevated or beneficial to communities. And it's changing in Canada so that it's much more demand driven, and it's based on requests from the members of a community that the library will make purchasing decisions based on the interests that are in the community. And also if an author resides in the community within a 100-kilometer radius, the librarian is much more interested in acquiring that work because it's reflective of the makeup and composition of the actual community where the library is located. So again, a lot of these issues of cultural superiority or Eurocentrism are more and more in play, even in places like Canada, where librarianship itself is changing and transforming to become more responsive and forward-looking. And it's ironic, I'll wrap up my prepared comments here by saying that earlier yesterday, when I was at my office, I was writing a memo for the members of the PLR Commission precisely on the subject of the payment of translators to graphic novels. So if a graphic novel had been translated and placed in a library collection, how to recognize the contribution and properly pay the translator. And earlier, I believe Eleanor had comments about the status of graphic novels and the importance of translation. And there are echoes of that in our work as well, as graphic novels become much more important and visible tools for teaching and enjoyed by not just young people, but all ages. The graphic novel is a format that is continuing to grow in popularity. Just to conclude, it is a journey. The first PLR schemes that were established following the Second World War in the Nordic countries eventually gave rise to a wave of Commonwealth countries, Australia and New Zealand, Canada, with PLR. The expansion of the European Union in the early 2000s created many PLR programs that exist on paper or on the books that are not adequately or fully developed or funded. And each country, each territory, by nature, should develop its own indigenous approach to PLR that is respectful and reflective of its cultural policy goals. And this is where I think Canada's been most successful, is in shaping the program as a cultural intervention to support homegrown creativity as a bulwark and a support to Canadian creators, and also now to the recovery and renaissance of Indigenous language creators who create in many different languages, many of which are incredibly fragile at the moment, but are on a return pathway with new generations of readers and new generations of books. And this is part of the work we're doing in Canada now, is to increase our knowledge and increase our contact with Indigenous-led library networks, because they do exist. There is a new generation of Indigenous librarianship and librarians, and to build those bridges and to see if by providing payments to authors of books that are in libraries, we can further nourish and encourage that cultural recovery. Those are my remarks for right now, and I'm happy to chat or answer questions further, but thank you so much for including me and for welcoming me to your conference this morning. I have really enjoyed everything throughout this night of staying up and listening.
Thank you so much, Peter Schneider. And this public lending right for authors, I think it's, it's something that I wasn't au fait with prior to this discussion, because, it is incredibly important for authors to get their books into public libraries, and for people to read books that reflect back on their communities and who they are. I mean, I see this, there's a message here in the chat. Good day, I'm Mabore Redis Mokhashwa from Limpopo. I have self-published a nonfiction Sepedi book titled Bohwa Vyarena, and I came second in the Soplaki EU Awards, and the translation of the poem was not good. My book is not in bookstores and I still need to learn about book marketing. Sometimes other authors don't share their challenges, and we think that all is good until you publish your own book. Thank you so much for this information. And that's the thing, right? It's very difficult to justify, marketing expenses, even when you work I've worked in a publishing house, and because the capital that's needed to produce a book is immense. Deciding how much to spend on marketing when you can't adequately strategize that this is going to sell X amount of copies. So, some book launches don't even sell a single book, where there's a book event and people can meet the author, but they still, they don't manage to sell. So that's another very interesting aspect, but it's also a challenge to authors, right? Because You spent all this time doing the labor of producing the work. Now you're expected to have another skill set, which is in the business of it. And I'd like to hear from Usihle about, how have you been able to kind of push back in terms of getting your book out there and marketing? Do you market your books on your own? And Peter, you can also contribute in terms of what kind of marketing activities a lot of writers and publishers participate in. And Mam Eleanor Sisulu says, perhaps we should start with a campaign for PLR on Indigenous language books. Thank you, Peter and Sihle, for the great presentations. Excellent, insightful presentations, says Estelle Neethling. And Zukisa wants to know who pays for the PLR, how does it work, especially to the public borrowing the books from the library, or is it the government? So what has happened in Canada is that, it's a program to compensate workers in the book value chain. So I presume that such a scheme would have been funded through, organs of the state and then other fundraising mechanisms. But Sihle, your input, and then Peter, you can also give us a little bit more insight into how it's funded. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much, Karabo. Just a few remarks specifically based on what Peter has said. It's very insightful, and that is why I appreciate this symposium, because it highlights some of the issues that are happening globally, so that we do not have to reinvent the wheel here in South Africa. I like the fact that they are looking at the stock. In other words, for the mere fact that your book is already in the library, then you'll get compensated for that. I must say that here in South Africa, we're looking at joint, so you're looking at stock, which is what in Canada they are doing. It's your book is already in the library, so there's compensation for that. It's cataloged, it's definitely in the library. So that's the stock option. If your book is in the stock. Whereas in other countries, they do the exact opposite. It's one thing that your book is in the library, but someone needs to take it out. So they work on what we call the loan system. So somebody actually needs to loan it out, and then only then will you benefit. Our thinking with the team was, what if we have pretty much something somewhere in the middle, joint loan and stock? In other words, you will be compensated for the fact that your book is already in the library. But that will mainly or only or exclusively be, this is the thought, just putting it out there, indigenous languages. So as someone who's published in an indigenous language, your book is already in stock, is already in the public library. Even if it's not loaned out, there is still that amount that will accrue to you purely because there is proof that your book is in stock. And then if it is loaned out, obviously, then you'll be compensated again. But if your book is in English, this is the thought, you'll only be compensated on loan. So this, again, will work in conjunction with exactly the other session that we had on indigenous languages, so that there is more benefit to someone who has written and published in indigenous language. But there's a bigger issue at hand, is your book actually has to be in the public library. And I think that is where the biggest issue will be. How do you then get your book into the public library? I like what Canada is doing, the fact that people who are self-published, because that's another issue as well. You've got quite a number of people in this country who are self-published, and their books hardly ever make it to public libraries, and they don't make it into most of the mainstream bookshops. Again, that is another challenge that we need to face. But I like what Canada is doing, because there are a number of people that, if you only focus on people who are traditionally published, a number of people might be left out. So that is something that we still need to look at. But just my entire observation, again, on what you asked, Karabo, with regards to marketing and things like that, that is one thing that I learned after writing my first book, is that you think, okay, I put the manuscript together and then it was edited, and then there was this up and down, and then eventually now the book is out there. Then you realize, no, but now I have to be a marketer. People have to know that Sihle has written this book. So it's not just about the actual writing. You also need to be a marketer, and also just understand the entire value chain, broadly speaking, of how the book ends up being in the shelves. And lastly, I want to just briefly talk about the coalition of stakeholders, because it's key, it's the foundation. You will never have PLR if there is no buy-in from the other key stakeholders, especially the issue of librarians. That late last year, there was a presentation by ANFASA where we actually published this issue of, we actually presented this issue of PLR to an association of librarians in South Africa. It was a virtual event, but yeah, we presented to them. So at least the librarians in South Africa are aware of the intention of what we have in mind. But obviously the key concern again was, where will the money come from? I think that has been partly answered. And that is why in future we need to engage more with the department, specifically the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, because that's the key stakeholder. And in fact, almost all countries, the money comes from central government. So that's the key stakeholder that we need to look into. But it is a journey, and I'm so happy that we are having this conversation, so that hopefully one day we'll look back and say we're part and parcel of people who not only conceived this thing as far as introduction into South Africa, but also played a key and a leading role in ensuring that it is finally implemented. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that, Asihle. I'll get your comment just now, Peter. Sandile Ngiti's raised two interesting points. He says Central and Peter's presentation are two main points for me. One, that every author must be organized and get involved in organizations that lobby for authors. That is incredibly important. And secondly, it is imperative to lobby for a legislative environment that enables for more public support of authors. And you know, we're going to have reflections from Lisa Kumbrink in a few minutes, who's head of the National Language Service at the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. Because, you know, it's looking at from budgetary issues to even how within the department, you know, do different units speak to each other in a sort of a synchronized and congruent way, so that, you know, from publication of a book to getting into different libraries in different provinces, right? Because you have different languages that are spoken depending on where you are in South Africa, and making sure that, you know, all the work that authors produce in indigenous languages reaches the intended audience. What are your thoughts on Sandile's inputs, Peter, with regards to the points that he drew from your presentation?
I completely agree. I think that these are things I'm really pleased that people are picking up on, because I agree. That's the experience in the UK, in Canada, everywhere where they've been successful in pushing and implementing a PLR scheme has been the work of authors, advocates, and organizations, and the sense of community. It's that sense of togetherness and community of many people raising their voices together to ask for something. And the fundamental value for me in public lending right, it's not simply the element of financial compensation, because the amounts can be small. It's respect. It's respect and recognition for the cultural value and importance of the work and its contribution to a healthy society and to future generations. And I think those are sometimes very winning conversations and arguments that can have a wider reception and uptake across different stakeholder communities. When we talk about the respect for recorded culture and written culture and what we would like to see in our societies going forward, that compensating authors is a sign of respect for their contribution to the common good. And I think that this is where bringing the more progressive voices from the library community and the publishing community on board in common cause is a winning formula that will take time. But again, it's that sense of solidarity and of creating that climate of respect. And finally, the fact that we can provide a payment in Canada to an author of a volume of poetry where the library may only have one copy, but it sits in the library and is available for someone to come in and read, whether it's loaned 100 times or not. And that we can provide compensation for books in indigenous languages where the literacy and the readership might be restricted at the same level as providing Margaret Atwood with her check. There's something really powerful in that for me in terms of cultural fairness and respectful inclusion. And each country can decide its own formulas. The beauty of the commission in Canada, it takes that government funding each year, it takes that pot of money, and then the writers decide with the librarians and publishers how to spend it, how to design the payment formulas and the criteria for the eligibility of the books. This is a great conversation.
Authors are also teachers. A program that enables authors to be compensated for school visits would be a game changer. Yet the schools need the input of authors. It is incredibly valuable to children to have author visits. Yes, I agree. And kids get so excited when they meet the authors behind their favorite stories. You know, it's really powerful. I also really appreciate the idea of respect, right? That this is a sector that is also values driven. Because we're speaking to issues that are at the core of how do we create a more equitable society and a society that values humanity. And I'm willing to accept inputs from everyone. You may raise your hand or put comments in the chat. Sihle, what are your thoughts? Would you like to provide any inputs?
I must say again, I appreciate the input from Peter, because these are the people that have led the way. They've been there before us. One key issue, which is very key, at least to me, and it's one of the issues where there could be some stumbling block. Again, it's without your book in the public library. I cannot overemphasize this. Without your book in the public library, you cannot benefit from the scheme. Even if, let's say, starting from next year, all of a sudden, yes, by miracle, we do now have the scheme. The key issue is, how do you get your book into the public library? To me, that is so key, because having PLR scheme approved, yes, it's great. But unless that happens, and I still think in this country, it's not very clear with regards to how do you get your book into the library, you know, the criteria that is used and so forth and so on. And I like what they do in Canada, where they are looking at this community-led system, where actually the community says, you know, these are the types of books that we would like to see in our local library. So that, you know, there is ownership with regards to the product that is at the local library. And to me, that would be very important. And I heard him talk about also 100-kilometer radius thing. You see, we currently do not have such issues here in South Africa, where we have community-led systems, where, you know, it's the community that just decides which book must be in the library. So that's some of the things that we need to look at. And I also like this issue of the contribution to society. As part of the lobbying, as part of the advocacy, it's besides just the financial aspect, it's just that, it's the contribution, the role that is played. And sometimes we just don't pause and think, without authors, there will just be no books. It's as simple as that. You know, without the actual people who write books, there'll just be no books. So that is how it needs to be addressed as well. So this is the conversation. I'm glad we are having this conversation, and I really hope that there will be more authors. We'll talk to other people, to other stakeholders, that there is this initiative which is spearheaded by ANFASA, and more people will come on board, because, you know, we need more people more or less saying exactly the same thing, because believe it or not, obviously there will be some pushback here and there. So we need to speak with one voice as stakeholders. I'm talking about librarians, I'm talking about publishers, and I'm talking about authors, so that eventually when the time comes, we can have an effective and a successful system implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sandile also says deposit libraries are a good point of departure. This used to be legislated, if I'm not mistaken. He says librarians must be engaged on a regular basis. Having a book in a library should not be a complex matter at all. I do agree. And how would PLR work on ebooks? I mean, I suppose this is from Samuel Magora. I suppose it would work in the same way, right? Because the book has to be, once it's in the library, whether you're borrowing the book as a physical book or you're borrowing it as an ebook, shouldn't make too much difference. But Peter, you're more au fait with this. Is there any difference with the way that an ebook would work?
Oh, hello. In 2016 in Canada, the commission decided to bring ebooks into the eligibility model to include ebooks in addition to print books. And we do the same thing. We look by ISBN number. So we look by the catalog number of the ebook, and if it's in the collection of the library, it receives the same payment as if it was the print. So we're completely neutral now on whether the library has a printed version or an ebook version of the same title. And it's been fairly easy to implement in Canada. I know that there has been a lot of pushback in Europe, where ironically they have very well established PLR programs, but the librarians are fighting in the courts to say that an ebook is not a book. So again, it's one of the advantages of Canada not being bound to legislation or copyright law, in that as a cultural support, we could bring in the ebook payments without going into a dispute over the status of an ebook, whether it's really a book or not.
Right, yes, and that's the thing with technology, right? The law is always catching up with technology, but such is the nature of human innovation. Well, thank you for this really insightful discussion. Now it's time for us to have the conversation where we just open it up, open the discussion up to the points that that have been raised throughout this morning's conference. Whether you'd like to contribute on giants of letters, power in indigenous languages, or earning a living as an author. If you would like to present your questions or to even contribute by way of comment, please raise your hand so that I can let you in and we can have the discussion. And if there's anything else that you'd like to raise as well, you are more than welcome to do so. I was particularly inspired by Dr. Bongani Nyoga's presentation on you know, the value of social sciences and his work on Archie Majeke and this idea of the Shanghai intellectual. You know, it's something that is personally very very close to me, because I am doing my master's in migration and displacement, and just even getting issues like ethics clearance on how you hope to conduct your research, when you know for a fact that, you know, from the feedback you get from your ethics committee, for example, you know that the people who are making these decisions on whether to give you clearance or not are actually familiar with the habitus, as it were, where, you know, I'm a Black person studying my own people, but having to explain just certain social phenomena that unless you are a Black person, you wouldn't really have insight into it. And with my particular example, it's the hair salon environment, right? In terms of how they conduct, how they work and how they operate. And there's certain aspects that, you know, unless you are familiar and you take yourself out of there into those spaces, you wouldn't understand why certain methodological decisions are made. And I'm currently in a battle with the chair of the ethics committee on my methodological decisions, even though my supervisors have approved them. So, and this is simply because this person is not, doesn't have insight into that environment, and is telling me that, and my supervisors that that I don't know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about my own space, you know, as a Black woman who uses hair salons. So I mean, and those
Hello?
things, I mean, these are also institutions. Can anybody hear me? I'm just waiting for people to raise their hands.
Yes, I'm there. I can't raise my hand.
Oh.
I'm somewhere else.
Okay, and Dr. Winston, yes, you're welcome.
That I'm happy, yes. Start my video. What's that now? Yes, thank you for the platform. I would like to say that I really, do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you loud. Yes. We hear you loud and clear.
Yes, I would like to say firstly that I really appreciated the presentations that were made today. They are highly informative, and I think I should think that ANFASA did well with this platform today. I'm also a board member of ANFASA. But I think at the end of it all this should be put together, because we're in a symposium, put together and sift out information that can be used to promote particularly the indigenous languages literature. Here we are sitting with a complex problem, a very complex problem, because of historical reasons. And I'm not saying because of history, therefore, we cannot solve it. We can, but we need a very intensive concentration on the areas that have been cited today. One of the areas is the area of, we are talking about organizations, that people should belong to organizations for PLR and all that. But there are no organizations or associations in African languages literature. They're not there. If you have them, then they are weak, very weak. You only have about 10 to 12 people who are in that organization. I'm just citing this as a simple answer to what has been presented. So we have a problem, a real big problem, a complex one for African languages. And I propose, if you can look at the chat there, I propose that we should have something like African languages literature summit, where we can further, and under the auspices of ANFASA, where we can further discuss these problems for African languages literature and see if we cannot reach a point where we can solve some of them. Because as I can see, I don't see a future. I don't see any future, sorry, for African languages literature. There's no future for it. If you look at the books that have been prescribed in the schools, and I'm not saying we should prescribe books for schools only or write books for schools only, but if you look at the books that have been prescribed, they're very low. The orthography and spelling rules are not considered. The content, it's weak. If I were to give you an example, you would be shocked. And I wrote to the publishers. They never came back to me, nothing whatsoever. But let's try to come up with a summit. And this can be harvested from this Power of Authors Symposium, so that we work towards promoting and developing African languages literature. If we don't do that, then the future for African languages literature is doomed. I'm not being negative, but I can tell you, if we look back between 1980 and 1990, 2,000 books were published in Sesotho. From 1994 to today, only 50 books have been published. But not all of them are quality books. They're very low. And the authors who have written those books do not like it if you say the spelling, the orthography, the content, it's not good. They don't like it. But it's because there are no organizations and associations to guide them. Thank you. That is my contribution. Thank you, Karabo.
Thank you, Dr. Mohapi. And yes, if there's no one to guide you, and authors, they are precious about their work, but you need to also for your own pride and your own sense of integrity. I would rather get the guidance, even if it hurts, before the work is out there, because once the horse is bolted, it's very hard to bring it back, to come back from that. Estelle says the challenge of a publisher needing to recoup their development costs before the question of royalties becomes a possibility is, in my opinion, a problem for the author of a nonfiction work that has a limited opportunity of large sales. The years that precede publication and the aftermath can be disheartening, as there is no interim income at all with regard to hard work and perseverance over many, many years. All right, and then Sandile, I know that you'd wanted to raise something when we were having the discussion on power in indigenous languages. Has your point been addressed, or would you like to make it now? If you're still there, Sandile Ngiti.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, my dear sister. Thank you so much. I had wanted to just contribute a few points. One, somebody had asked me about the availability of the book I translated with the help of Monica and Richard Bartlett at Monica Siba and Richard Bartlett at Aflame Books. The book is not available, so but there has been talk that we could revisit it, and I hope those talks will continue, and hopefully they'll result in a book. And there were so many experiences learned there, and one of them has to do with the fact that you need a great deal of resources, support, and so on to be successful in the sphere of translation. And, you know, universities like Stellenbosch, for instance, I would imagine maybe the Free State, I'm not sure, they have put so much into translation. And I think until translation in indigenous African languages is taken seriously, you know, in the institutions of higher learning in particular, it won't go anywhere. So the Germans, for instance, have done it, the French and so on, they're doing it. So we must be very serious about these issues, because if we're not serious, we're not gonna achieve anything. So the other point is that, you know, writers who write in indigenous languages of Africa are also important producers of knowledge. They're not inferior, and they have to be supported, critiqued, and so on, like anybody else. But also the academy for me is very interesting, because if works are not studied, critiqued, and made relevant to various fields, you know, of knowledge production that the universities, schools, and so on have to deal with, those works become, you know, irrelevant. Because in as much as leisure reading is going to be very important and will continue to be important, we must really admit that there are certain spheres of the book value chain that are more effective. And that is how you begin to have an industry proper, but also it's not just an industry. It has to do with what value are we making as authors to the greater good of society. So these are issues that I thought I must raise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandile. Yes, indeed. You know, the issue again, when it comes to things like funding higher education as well, especially when it comes to, you know, to do this kind of work, is that, you know, even when you look at the funding that's available, and I mean, how do you spread resources across different generations, right? Because one tends to be more likely to have a more vested interest in this as one matures through life. But the funding only goes, most of it, to a much younger generation for whom this isn't necessarily something as urgent. And if there are those opportunities, there's not much encouragement in studying the humanities and investing in the humanities when looking at things like indigenous language and you know, literature. You know, the encouragement is rather study science and technology, and we need to, you know, look at the fourth industrial revolution. But this is also about, you know, we should be able to know linguistics. We should be able to, our kids should be able to program, write computer programs and software programs in their own indigenous languages, or coming from that paradigm and way of abstract thinking. As Zukiswa says, thanks, Ntate Mohapi. Back in the 90s, we used to have organizations like Bala Writers Guild guiding us as isiXhosa writers, and Mboniseni Ndlovu says for isiZulu books, we still have the USIBA organization guiding isiZulu writers. You know, I would love, if I had a pot of money, to start a whole foundation that invests in the work of historians and different generations, you know, of people who are invested in revitalizing our history and our languages, because sometimes you need people with a little bit more wisdom and who've got the advantage of years and experience behind them, while you also focus on the youth and making sure that you develop them for the future. And Zama says, Sandile. Well, now it is 12:30, so it's time to move it along, and we'd like to hear on the reflections of the power of authors, and today's conference from Lisa Kumbrink, who is a poet, essayist, and organizer of literary events, having worked in national government in various capacities for more than 20 years. She also worked prior to that as a lecturer and editor. She is currently the head of the National Language Service at the Department of Sports, Arts, and Culture here in South Africa. Lisa, always a pleasure to speak to you at these events. I hope you're ready to give us your presentation. Take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Karabo. Can you hear me? If I can first get that technical matter cleared.
Loud and clear. Thank you. Loud and clear.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been an interesting discussion, and thank you to yourself as program director for really encouraging debate and also making very succinct comments yourself. But I'm not going to start my video as I've been requested to do because my network is very unstable. I've been moving between Wi-Fi and hotspotting. So just to be safe now, I'll rather not start the video, but maybe I can flash myself right at the end, if that's fine. I think that the whole topic of the power of the author has been a very interesting one. But I think let me first dispense with formalities. I've greeted the program director, but also Professor Ngubane, Monica Siba, and Samu as the face or the faces of ANFASA, the esteemed writers present, and also my former and favorite colleague, Bra Winston Mohapi, who is present. With my words coming at the tail end of this discussion, I believe that much of what needs to be said has already been said this morning. And as I reflect, I'm not going to even try to summarize what the various speakers have said. But the talks and discussions have been thought-provoking enough to remind me, of two texts that were considered very important in the mid to late 1990s. And I think I'm thinking of it now again, because maybe we are nearly another 2 years from now, we would be 30 years into our democratic order. And the two texts that I'm reminded of, I think they were written around 1989 and the early 90s, try to prophesize or direct where South African literature should be heading. And in so doing, what these texts tried to do was almost predict what would happen in the future. One text, which I think everyone would be familiar with, was Njabulo Ndebele's rediscovery of the ordinary, where he critiqued what could be called struggle literature, argued that there were books that persistently wrote about the political environment and the conditions in which they found themselves, and therefore was simply making political statements rather than advancing an artistic perspective. Later, L.B. Sachs, in a rather seminal essay at the time called Preparing Ourselves for Freedom, argued that writers should now be free to write a whole range of things. Later, in his afterword to his book, he took a more cautionary approach, having met with writers around the country. All this was 30 years ago or more, but I think when we speak about the power of the authors, the power of our writing, I think the rediscovery of the ordinary is not necessarily where we now find ourselves. I don't believe that reality, even viewed or interpreted through literature, in South Africa at any rate, has become ordinary. Nor do I believe that we have the full power that we thought a post-1994 order would provide us with. As authors, we are probably not powerful except through our words. And possibly we are even powerless in the bigger scheme of things. And we may even be more disempowered than we previously were, as the intellectual voices in our current reality get less respect than they did before and are really drowned out by all the performers in the performance space. So, and probably even our literature is still awash with a fascination in going back to understand the past, not truly being able to move forward as if we truly reside in a frozen moment that is repeating itself. But perhaps the terms of our freedom that emerged at the talks about talks and later were writ large in our constitution have established the foundational fault lines of our continued imprisonment rather than forging our freedom. So even when we look forward, we still look back. Secondly, I think another moment that we find ourselves in the here, in and now, is that the authors, at least in this discussion, we who are here are also survivors. We have dodged bullets. We have dodged violence. We have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been cancellations and deletions of us on social media. And we are not defeated or dead, but we are not quite living either. If to live means to see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil about what we see, then we are most certainly not free. And then to go on, have we won the right to write or research what we like in the languages that we like? I do not think that that victory has been completely won. The discussion today clearly outlines that there are a lot that remains to be done in this arena. But also, what are the truths of our reality? Because as one person writes somewhere, another person is looking for shelter or has lost family members in the floods or from COVID, etc. Whatever we do sometimes still seems to be a luxury. Is it enough as authors to speak truth to power? And do we also speak truths to ourselves? You know, we are still witnessing in various technological platforms the implementation in a way of what Roland Barthes called the death of the author. But to the death of the author, we may even wish to add the nation state and much else, because the global reality at present is probably more fascist even than capitalist. And then again, to return to that notion of the performance space of the nation state, which then recognizes performance, the marchers, you know, the toys, but not the thinkers. And then there's the reality of xenophobia, racism, tribalism, sexism, and also the notion that all languages and literatures can free us, but they can also oppress us. Some, of course, more than others. You know, we are also facing the economic reality that has been presented today of the author reduced to be seen as a mere content creator, and the possible planned downfall of the book as a physical entity. And in the face of all these things, we have to ask ourselves how, as Karabo has also said, do we assert the humanism of the author and the right to write and the right to own your text? So a lot of discussion today has been about how do we claim those rights? How do we ensure, for instance, and that there is not only a national policy on the book alone, but one that takes pride in South African authorship? Since in any case, the nation lives in the pages of books, as it is truly intangible in other ways, less we talk about flags and anthems and sporting activities. But I think what is important about what we're seeing today is that writers who are present, ANFASA at the lead, are trying to look at additional ways in which we can claim our freedom and our space to be ourselves. The public lending right is one such very important initiative, and we are glad that our Canadian comrade can also be with us here today. There's also, of course, the idea that there should be a tax on photocopies. I know that Copinor in Norway has been preaching this to us for many decades. So what are the additional ways in which we can assert ourselves and assert our claim of profits, given that the existing bills that are in Parliament do not really seem to assist us in this regard? Yesterday, I was trying to tune into the Department of Trade, Industry and Competitions discussions around the sort of copyright and performers bills, and unfortunately, I even lost connection. but you know, I'm sure there are things happening there that do not necessarily, you know, are to our advantage, so to speak, since there were great limitations on what they could change in looking at the existing draft bills. Just to say a little bit about the work of the department, I'm not going to say a lot because also as has been recognized earlier, there's so many responsibilities in the department locked up in different spaces. Libraries is a directorate, books and publishing is a directorate, languages, where I reside is yet a different, you know, sort of area of work. But just, you know, we know that from 2022 to 2032 is the UNESCO declared decade of Indigenous languages. And as the department, we are together with stakeholders producing a roadmap for this decade. We are also working with other stakeholders to try to have a national conference around languages, and maybe later in the year in November, to do an all-African conference that revives the initiative that was started by Professor Mbulelo Mzamani, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Nawal al-Sadawi, that really gave rise to the Asmara Declaration. But in conclusion, I just want to say that the current world in which we reside as authors, as those who are trying to assert our power, is a world of no quick wins or easy victories. It's a world where we do not have the comfort of sightseeing, but are very embedded in reality. The fifth wave is already upon us. Mantras such as "we dare not fail" no longer make sense. And I would say, and maybe it's a voice of pessimism, but I would say let us succeed, even as we fail. Let us move forward even as we retreat. Let us ensure that in all kinds of ways our voices are heard, and that through organizations led by, like ANFASA, that we protect each other. As the only one thing that holds true is that there is safety in numbers, and in numbers there is also power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa Combrink. Yeah, those words deserve a little bit of silence afterwards, because, yeah, incredibly profound. And you can hear the creativity, you know, and just the commitment and the sheer love for the work that everybody here is doing for posterity. And we do know that the gains that we want, we may not see them in our lifetime, but that doesn't mean that we need to stop. Let's just keep it going, indeed. And now I'd like to welcome to offer us the closing address, Monica Siba, who founded ANFASA in 2004 and was its first director. She's currently a member of the ANFASA board, is a publishing consultant and book editor, and co-author with Nicholas Evans of The Politics of Publishing in South Africa. It was published in 2001, as well as a guide to the management of copyright in book publishing written for WIPO. Monica has also written numerous articles on copyright and publishing, and she is a founder member of the African Publishers Network. Monica, thank you so much for starting ANFASA and for continuing to support in the many ways that you do the endeavors of writers. Please grace us with your closing remarks.
Thank you, Karabo. The pen is mightier than the sword. The power of the written word, the power of authors. Throughout the history of humankind, the purveyors of knowledge and the tellers of stories have held a special place in society. Some authors can truly be said to have changed the course of history, as Karl Marx, for instance, Martin Luther, whose writings led to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther King, who impelled the American Civil Rights Movement and inspired the Black Consciousness Movement. Authors who have altered the face of humankind's inner thoughts. Think Sigmund Freud. Closer to home, Sol Plaatje stands out as one who had such a powerful influence and is still inspirational today. Dr. Bongani Nyoka spoke this morning with striking lucidity about Archie Mafeje, whose thought is casting a searching light into the study and understanding of the humanities. So very much more, so many more. This morning has truly been a mind-opening experience. We would not be doing justice to our African heritage unless we recognize the writing that has the power to make change. Only a few authors get to change the course of history. It's true, but there are many aspects of the power of authors, and in a series of 3 major seminars which feature conversations between authors, by authors, and about authors, ANFASA has been exploring some of them. When I conceived of the power of authors as a topic for exploration by ANFASA, I was conscious of raising the status of the author in our South African society. So very few, if one doesn't count mass market bestseller novelists, so very few are well known, and not nearly enough of the books they write are well read. So we in ANFASA set out to try and put that right. This is the second seminar of 3. Next year, we'll round up the avenues we explored, possibly taking some of them further to tease out even more meaning. It is progress on a small scale, but we hope to get a buzz going among authors and ultimately to stimulate more quality writing. So I trust you've enjoyed and gained from today's seminar, and that you are looking forward to the next installment in 2023. And in closing, we invite you to join ANFASA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica Siba. And that does bring to an end this year's installment of the Power of Authors conference. And I'm definitely going to join ANFASA. ANFASA has been incredible in just in terms of supporting my endeavors as somebody who really believes in the elevation of the status of the author in society. In my various incarnations across my working life. So yeah, this is something that I'm definitely putting my name behind and making that commitment. You have been an amazing and attentive audience. I really appreciate you all making the time to participate in today's conference. Thank you so much to the organizing team as well for being so gracious and making sure that I feel at home. So just in closing, it would be lovely if everyone could switch on their mics briefly just to wave goodbye. I would like to see some of your wonderful faces. And yes, you can turn on your mics to say goodbye as we are about to end the meeting. Bye, everyone.
Hi, thank you very much,
Bye. Thank you,
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Siyabonga.
Siyabonga. Bye, dankie. Tot ziens.
Bye, everyone.
Samaya Sinclair.
Samaya Sinclair.
Bye-bye.